Seven Devils, Book 1 of the Brujocorridos, Part 2, by Joshua Chapa, Chapter 15, Bedtime for Bonzo. Vic wasn't dead. He woke up in the nicest bed he'd ever been in. Although it was well decorated, the room was clearly a guest quarters. It had paintings and statues that were reproductions of famous ones by Van Gogh, Dali, and Michelangelo. None of the authentic pieces or fresh flowers that Vic expected were in Floor's room. The bedding was soft and cool. An antique goose down comforter maintained meticulously over the years. Fading pastels that did not match the season, or they were probably not frequently utilized. Or old pieces that were disposable, given that a bleeding man was put down on them. There was a large television at the other side of the room on top of a counter. At one time it had been very nice TV, good enough at one time to be someone's main set. But it was a giant, squared CRT television, and so it was 15 or 20 years out of style and definitely not anything near HD. Vic didn't like Mexican television, so it was no bother. The bullet wounds were still tender. The bandages were well maintained even though Vic didn't see any sign of a nurse. There was a pitcher of iced tea and left out for him, so he poured himself a glass. He'd need to recover his strength before he could heal the wound. He might even have to let this one fix itself naturally if he couldn't get to a spiritual cleansing soon. Vic knew he had some taint from all the fun stuff he had gotten into, and that kind of magic, even in trace amounts, doesn't facilitate with healing. "You're up." "Good," Floor said. She wore a silk robe tied tightly over her body. Vic could only imagine what was under there that preserved her modesty. She actually seemed more conservatively outfitted in the sleepwear than what she wore during their interrupted lunch. "You got him?" Vic asked as he started to get up, but quickly recognizing that he wasn't wearing anything under the comforter. He stayed where he was, shuffling some of the cloth over his waist. "Yes. You were right about how to stop him. He didn't die, but she paused and struggled to find the words. "When I disassembled him, he wasn't able to pull himself back together. I called my priest and they took what was left of him away. That'll be an interesting ride home. Your clothes were torn up. Not just by the wounds, but when the EMTs arrived to patch you up. I sent someone to get you some from the store. You were out cold for a few days, almost wore out your welcome." She teased. He moved to sit up and protest her comments from a less pitiful position, but Vic ached all over and his muscles were cold. He took a minute to find a method of posturing up that wasn't too painful or awkward and stared at Floor. "Is that how you handle your men, Floor?" Vic asked. "When you're finished with them, they get a gift basket and get sent on their way." "Sounds like a football player." "American football." "Not." "Don't you dare," she said, pressing a finger to his lips. She sat next to him on the bed. Vic reached over to put his arm around her waist, but the gesture was painful. His conowodling side had been the one hit by the bullet. She chuckled and put her arm around him, and started combing her fingers through his hair. "So you've helped me out twice now. Saved your life one of those times." "Literally took a bullet for you," he said. "That's a good line. Do you use it on all your women?" She asked and slid a hand under the sheets. "I'd be dead if I did. I've gotten shot a few times, not as many times as I've fallen in love. Certainly not as many times as I've been with a woman." Which was a lot. Vic's shuddering under her fingertips was strained, but the pain and pleasure complemented one another. It's not a healthy way to live. Getting shot at. Saying love so quickly. "Unfortunately, I don't think I can keep you around unless you ask. If I want to be the Iron Queen, I can't keep a court wizard around. Or any man, really. People will talk. Then they'll prefer to talk to him. I'm not the by anyone's side type, baby doll. Doesn't work out for me, or them. Bad juju follows me around. They wind up in the hospital. The grave. Or a marriage. I don't think this is going to work out," he said. She rubbed his inner thigh and Vic rested his head on her shoulder, nipping at her neck. "Then we are in agreement about things. If you're in town, you're welcome to visit. Just call first." "I may not be available," she said, but was interrupted by Vic's hand finding its way into her robe. He squeezed her side and fingers moved up and down her body. "Oh, I know you're going places. Just don't forget about me when you're at the top and you hear someone needs my help," he said and pulled her over him. Chapter 16, Pigs Like Me. Vic didn't get much time off. Floor offered to take him on a cruise, and he entertained the notion of being a kept man for a cartel empress until he finally checked his email when the sex stopped. He had a voice message. Who still leaves voice messages? Vic didn't get cell service in Mexico too far south of the border. Most of the border towns in Texas like Matamoros, Tamaulipas, and even Piedras Blancas could get a weak roaming signal close to the border crossing. Vic had a carrier on both sides of the border, but he rarely operated in metro areas and money was always tight. So he gave it up. Floor dismissed the existence of a supposed cartel network of cell towers by refusing to comment on it, so that was more proof of its existence than anything. But on to business. Another small town, Peña, had been overrun by demons. Nothing that the government wouldn't be able to sweep under the rug as an isolated example of corruption of the local authorities. When one little white girl goes missing, it's national news. When a rainbow coalition of students disappear for a few days, it's just a bunch of college kids being assholes. Until enough of them stop calling for money from their parents or booty calls from the townies who didn't leave those jobs at Walmart like everyone else. Death is solitary. Mass death makes is too big a downer to make the news, but is no less easily forgotten when someone steers the discussion on Facebook to guns or abortion or Muslims. When blame gets thrown around, it is always at something that never sticks. Let alone demons or wizards or vampires. People used to think they had to hide or else someone would see the truth. Now people are too busy looking at themselves to notice. Demons enter the world in all the expected ways. Buy a Ouija board at Target. You're safe. Get it at an estate sale or find it in the trash of someone who hightailed it out of town. Good luck with all that. Get your tarot cards read downtown. You're probably safe unless you enter the room with an especially bad vibe. Not just statues of La Santísima Muerte displayed. Those things sell like hotcakes and the really pricey ones probably have a bunch of drugs in them, waiting for cash on delivery. But they're innocuous. Most would-be border mystics offer a wide range of expensive idols to worthless mythical figures. There aren't as many legitimate quacks who'd offer cleansings, exorcisms, and spiritual healing as there are fake psychics. There aren't enough believers who wouldn't just go to church to make it gainful employment. The handful that persist are easily dismissed as scumbags and grifters. The rest wind up as food or vessels for the real monsters out there, and eventually, more work for Vic. Trust your instincts. All mankind are imbued with a spark of the divine in creation, before they sully it with fleshly corruption, novel like fast food and reality television, and classical like your pick of the 7 deadlies. They have some sense of when things aren't right and when danger's afoot. Sure, you can be convinced to overlook this if that stranger's candy are the big pieces, not the Halloween-sized shit, but for the most part you don't get something in your life you didn't invite. Stay out of those places that feel wrong and don't cease to assuage your normal sense of metaphysical rebellion with the expected warding rosaries, votive candles, and the like. Vic stuck to salt. Cheap. Easily spread but also easily wiped away. That paradox is key to keeping away the spiritual nasties. Most structures built by certified masons do this, but the drying of the cement, subsequent science, engineering, etc., muddy the effect. Geomantic wards are necessary and effective, but have been left out more and more of today's strip malls and McMahon scions. This particular suburban town of Bernie was about a 45-minute drive in light traffic, and 2 hours in rush hour, from Santon, the nearest metro area, and was home to a nice red state mix of gentrifying professionals and the lower classes who have defended themselves with their guns and religion from the demons. And minorities. And Obama. But the Sunday Funnies version of the battle between the forces of good and evil that they get in church when there isn't football doesn't exactly tell you how to deal with them. The syncretized remedies of Santeria and Hodan don't fly in these safer and monochromatic areas. So someone Googles, how to get rid of demons, or, how to identify someone who's possessed, it cracks the top 5 suggestions during Halloween or during the times of your Hollywood releases horror movies with low expectations, and thanks to a spell Vic gets their contact information. It's a nice bit of technomancy that one of Vic's exes helped him with. It won't work with Bing, since Vic never dated anyone who worked for Microsoft. And no one uses Bing. Vic shoots them an email or sends a text and waits for a response, like the one that summoned him to burn. Vic wasn't in the book. Not that there was still a book. He might not need to hide, but he didn't want to be found by anyone who's just bored. Most of his business was referrals, friend of friends, but new customers in the internet age are needed for any business. He couldn't just put an ad on Craigslist. But that didn't stop him from looking through discussion boards when it was too long between jobs and he started to get antsy. Business was slow at the beginning. His birth name is Vicente Fuentes, and even after Obama, that's a little too much of a mouthful for some. People were ready to believe in magic and monsters again. But they wanted a little piece of shit with a British accent. Even where he lived, deep South Texas, unless you're part of the family, you're just another touristy brown guy who does all the crime everywhere. So, in a sort of betrayal to what he had been raised and trained to believe, Vic changed his name to Vic Fender. The work came pouring in. Many practicing wizards and witches do something similar. They have a nom de virga or what have you. This is not much different than that, unless you count the legal white face. Sympathetic magic doesn't work the same on humans as it does demons. And to a soul as sullied as his was, one more betrayal doesn't really measure to anything. Don't try anything, though. My true name is one of those long Mexican names that you don't see anymore but is still typical for someone born into a magical family. You've only got the part one told Floor and you'll need to offer me more than what she did to get more of it. And she did a lot. Demons are real. They come to the physical world and are twisted, scary monsters who will fuck shit up. Of course, those imps concerned with breaking the wall between this world and hell are not the real enemy of men. That would be the monolithic forces of the seven deadlies. Old hat for evil. These forces transcend the shallow presentation in Faust and the many video games out there. They have root in all men's souls and are not inherently malevolent. To feed those urges, let alone be ruled by them, is not certain damnation. Those CEOs and pimps and madams are certainly comfortable. And in your keeping up with the Kardashians, whether by chasing down that piece of the pie or just watching it on Netflix, you're indulging something, comfortably. Vic wasn't someone who could tell anyone else anything about resisting temptation. The pure are protected by their faiths and families. The wealthy serve without drawing attention to their insidious masters, who are fed when a family home is foreclosed on. When a bunch of roughnecks get blown up or one of them gets caught cruising a rest area and thinks it perfectly reasonable to kill the twink who he later claims was sexually assaulting him. Even our cries for justice feed the greater demons. When we go too far, those evils aren't going anywhere and must be capitulated to. They know their boundaries. When two people fuck and make a baby, even if it's unwanted, the miracle of creation washes away all sin. Some parents are blinded by this light, others are scared. Any hint of the divine is so blinding, and the demons stay away. They'd lose this fight, with fathers and mothers, divine or mortal. The demons we have to worry about starting shit are those beings lesser in every way but their hunger or desire. They can grow in power by victimizing mortals and harvesting faith, fear, adulation, or blood from them, but just like air feeds flame, so can a gust blow it out just as easily as spread it. They're a fickle lot. Some really care for mankind. Some come too. Many live among us and are able to gain some modicum of humanity. Some humans are better devils than these demons. Few who cross over have the means of winning a turf war with one of the big bads, but that doesn't stop them from trying. Pena, Texas. So named for the hills that just burst into existence in the middle of hundreds of miles of flatland. Hills that are only one in a number of inconveniences the illegal immigrants and smugglers face on their way to a better life or more money. There's little more than desert all around. The mountains are ways off south or northwest, their melted snow the clouds and sky. Usually such anomalous geography is a sign of some great celestial battle. Mythology of numerous cultures speaks of literal fights between holy and unholy figures before the crafty, balding ape started running the show. The defeated, profane god is cast deep into the abyss and earth is piled on top of it with a mass too great to escape. Until some idiot, would-be Satanist gets a bad idea and seeks to unearth that which was hidden away. Or plate tectonics. Or fracking. Hydraulic fracturing doesn't usually unleash demons from the subterranean hell to terrorize your children. Everything does, however, comes with a price. Freedom from foreign oil, which we actually purchase from our neighbors to the north and the south, we hardly get any from the Middle East, has the low price of the appearance of earthquakes in central Texas and water that can double as a lighter fluid for your barbecue. And the occasional demon infestation. Vic knew roughnecks. He was one for a spit when he thought he didn't need anything from high school except the piece of paper. And they don't fall prey to demon possession any more than anyone else. They're more likely to go home overcome by spirits, of the liquid variety. Many townships like Pena exist all over the breadbasket of our state. Well, not the breadbasket. The little bowl of oil that you dip your bread into next to your basket. The easily reached oil dried up, but new opportunity has arisen thanks to the advancement of the technology beyond digging a really deep hole and getting a really big straw. Everyone wins. Landowners get paid for their mineral rights, and even if they don't have any oil, they can put a few double wides on their land, set up the Wi-Fi, and rent out to the people who work at the rigs for an exorbitant amount of money. The townies get an infusion of cash into the local economy, maybe a new Walmart, some fast food restaurants, and jobs for as long as the tap water stays flammable. But these towns are usually very poor. Property value is low until it shoots out of the ground, and by the time everyone has a piece, it's on to the next place. The boom goes away, taking those promises of the future today with it. Try to get a decent cell signal out here, let alone order electricity, cable, or internet service through something other than a cooperative, and you'll salivate for the monopolies. There's not much for the kids to do besides the old mainstays of sex, drugs, and rock and roll from 10 years ago. Those with any modicum of smarts, talent, or foresight usually get out. Go to some big city. Or jail. Or the rigs. A few of them get onto America's Next Top Model or Got Talent, or The Voice. Some of them almost make it. More often, these days the big city eats up a few towns down the road, and then you have the real hope for deliverance. By making this place look like the same strip mall of stores off the expressway. Any expressway. It was November and rainy. A nice day, in context, because the region had just suffered through the most consecutive days of over 100-degree temperatures this year. Vic's contact was a landman named Montez who worked out of the local records office getting information on who owned what land and whose children had a claim to it. Most places have been at the digitization movement for over a decade now. Widespread, high-speed internet made this a possibility. And most of those cities, even the largest and well-funded, are still years from completely putting everything online into a searchable database. Despite the contrasting socioeconomic statuses, Bernie and Peña both gets their internet from a regional cooperative and doesn't have the budget to hire someone to scan all the documents, let alone all the high-definition devices that would make it worthwhile for people like Montez to go over. Oil and tech companies have offered contracts, but the Luddite holdouts don't want to let a threat into their record-keeping fiefdoms. If you take Oscar-winning actors and the environment into account, oil folks can't be trusted with the records. Even if you counted on them to do the right thing, made sure everyone gets paid fairly, here and their reticent third and fourth cousins could put the kibosh on a deal. Who would blame anyone for wanting to get them out of the loop? There was just as much a chance nothing would happen as there was an eventual class action suits. It looked like the part of the library no one visited anymore. With big books that were scary even if they had something other than handwritten accounts of taxes and deeds and whatnot. A large woman was behind the counter clicking through cat pictures on a computer screen. She looked like she hadn't moved from the building since it had gone up. She wore a silky white blouse with a pressed collar and bulbous sleeves. It was meant to hang loosely off of her, but she filled out more of it than was intended. Her arms were large and soft. Her hair a wiry and graying blonde. There was a sign-in sheet in front of her. She didn't say a word as she pointed to it, and after he signed in, Vic started looking for the landman. Their only patron of the establishment was a woman at one of the tables writing down contact information into a tablet. She was a hunt and pecker with the touch-screen keyboard. A bad sign. Most people prefer a paper copy of important documents. The post office stays in business because return receipt keeps official correspondence official. It's called a paper trail, after all. And a sealed envelope or binding in an official government record book carries some power. Literal, figurative, and magical, it's all rubbish. An electric trail of IP addresses, security footage, cell phone tower geo-tracking, and tweets create a trail and record of who was where. It's not easy for the old fossils and police departments and bureaucracy to follow as a stack of papers, but that's changing too, with the Google machine. Anyone who knows what they're doing is only spared the indignity of legwork with electronic records, but if you're willing to walk those 1,000 miles, nothing can stop you from faking documents and records. Vic, himself, had plenty of licenses and birth certificates from both sides of the border that will pass more than casual inspection, without magic. Inconsistencies in a document can be uncovered through forensics. But any stage magician, or illusionist, worth his birthday deposit knows the magic envelope trick that can take care of that. Montez, I presume. Vic asked. Who wants to know? She responded without looking up from her work, and when she did, oh, it's you. Let me finish this up. She resumed her inefficient typing and left a bookmark in several of the dog-eared record books. A pantsuit, Hillary Clinton type of woman. Purple dress shirt. Gray, felt-looking slacks and a jacket hanging over her chair. A reasonable-sized bag on the other chair. Larger, but not bedazzled with stones, sequins, or glass jewels. Vic could see a flask peeking out, but it wasn't hidden. Probably the only affectation that was for show or a display to the other people in the office. Oil office folk are the blue-collared sons of their fathers who either started in the fields or got let in on the action and are rough in a fraternity sort of way. Their patron St. George made it all the way to the White House on his connections, and he and his daddy shared name. These types won't throw open the doors for women like Montez, but once they got in and proved they could hang, they're one of the boys. Eventually the work that justifies but doesn't explicitly warrant the accusations of 75 cents on the dollar goes to the new scrub and they make bank. She did carry some weight on those parts that swell when one's work entails long, sedentary hours that necessitated a poor diet. The current oil boom meant a lot of driving around deep South Texas, which made it easy to eat bad and hard to find time to exercise. This isn't to say she wasn't attractive, she just had determined to get by on her job performance and muted some of the more obvious means of drawing the attention of a pig like Vic. He would have to try hard at objectifying her. "How do I know you're not a con man?" she asked. "Snake oil and water don't mix," Vic answered. "You look like you're from around here, Mr. Fender." But this could be one big prank. "There's a lot of oil money and a lot of bored landmen in my crew," she said, never looking away from him. "You weren't exactly advertising your problem, and the bosses never would do anything more than throw money at it. They have their own masters to appease, after all," he said. "How'd you know about our problem?" she asked. "About my suspicions. A little forensics on the YouTube video was easy enough," Vic answered. "Your IP has viewed it 20 times before it was pulled. Didn't even have to use any magic. So you're what you say you are." "Can you prove it?" Montez requested. "Lot of dry books here and old computers. Your tablet excluded. Any display would be asking for trouble. You can either believe me or not. You believed in demons before the video. You can either believe I can do something about it or I'm going to take that money and run." "But think of the children," Vic said. It was what one of the partners said that stood out. "Struck me as strange," she said. "When someone mentioned the video in the office a few days ago, he just said, we were due." An email went around asking for someone to look into the Pena records and files to see if we had any culpability and if anyone was going to be assigned to contact the Deca division. "Decameron, how did you know? The language for these things hasn't changed since we started drilling into the earth for that black gold. Oil men, whether American, British or the Middle Eastern, are superstitious, and so they had holy men and people like me sort out the appropriate wards and whatnot on the down low. They took the name as a sort of a joke, I think. Black Death, Black Gold." Vic had started to ramble, so he quieted down. "There's a lot of money in the budget for this, which is what I saw first. Then I got to the contract. And the threats," she uttered. "Standard stuff. The language has to be very specific. Immortal soul and the like to filter out the conmen and frauds. That's why, from my understanding of things, you're the only one plagued by the pangs of conscience on this issue, Ms. Montez. They only want to get the truly sorrowful or the foolish," Vic answered and took out an e-cigarette. He didn't smoke, but easy, inoffensive vices like vaping played right into Vic's particularly addictive personality. Some of them were roughnecks, the drunken stories I'd heard. "I thought they'd had too much," she said. "Not all accidents are accidents. Not counting the fights that break out in high-pressure settings, sometimes you poke into a little clutch of monsters. That's why they get tough, dumb sonsa bitches," Vic said and puffed out some vapor. "Has anything like this happened before?" she asked. "Several times. Not exactly like this. But any time you drill for oil, well, water, or if you're a bunch of bored kids trying to dig a hole to China, there's a chance of stepping into some demon shit. All those emotions are a light bulb and the underworld vermin pop up. A town goes crazy, it just happens. No one's going to blame the oil industry for cracking open a cold mountain demon prison when the media can blame terrorists or Ebola or cartels. But dealing with it is a part of the agreement they made to do business, and so if you want your fee we have to come to terms. Can you save them?" Vic thought before speaking. The easiest thing would be to blackwater everything. Send in the goons. Private security forces. Light the place up. Get the story written after the fact and hope no one makes it out. It may yet come to that. But maybe the townsfolks are hostages somewhere. Pena's just gone quiet, not ghost. Maybe there's a handful of big guys in charge that we can dispense and start the exorcisms en masse. Is that really what's going to happen? Probably not. Let me see the contract. Chapter 17, Prospero Año. Why does the prosperous want to see us? Alana asked. I don't give the orders and I didn't ask the reasons, Johann answered. The two wizards were dressed in what amounted to formal wear for the meeting with the de facto leader of the national ruling body of magical practitioners. Their robes reflected the traditions of their upbringing in the community. Johann was typical of the new school of magicians that still occupied an unquestioned place in the magical orthodoxy. His robes were closer to the graduate regalia of American universities. The black sleeves didn't extend past his forearms and were tucked into bracers that could go unadorned or have any number of enchantments placed upon them. The collar could be zipped up or left open like Johann had it. His hood could function as a cover of one's head when ritual magic necessitated such a veiling, unlike the respective cape-like hood of a graduate student's regalia. One could choose to further adorn themselves with any manner of necklaces, rings, or stoles. Johann had a few such items that displayed hermetic symbolism, layered triangles, pentacles, and runes. His approach to magic was analogous to the way higher education now regarded classical education. Alana was as traditional a wizard as there could be that didn't grow up in a castle. Her background was one of privilege complicated by the manifestations of her abilities that her family wrote off as quirks. She adjusted well to a selective private school and despite average capabilities and modest talent, she started to really come into her own the farther she got from her adolescence. Her attire was typical for such a wizard. The outfit was more of a sparkling, sky blue gown than the typical flowing robes, but it was more of a hybrid between the two rather than more of one design than the other. Alana normally preferred functional attire. Her childhood memories of dozens of cotillions, keen signoras, and other formals left her with disdain for the requisite uniforms of such gatherings. She didn't hate looking nice or having a sense of style, but despite being a meritocracy, she was especially sensitive towards any perceived gender bias of the magical community. She couldn't refute most of the explanations she encountered for the distinctions between wizards and witches. The least satisfying were for the most superficial differences, like formal wizard attire. She was troubled by the fact that Johann was the hegemony's preferred representative despite her superior skills. He was just better with people. He never made her feel excluded, but he always received their orders or requests and would bring them to her. He rarely worded them like he was giving the commands, but if their labors in the region bore fruit she knew he'd receive the commendations and credit before she did. The two of them exited the elevator and proceeded up the stairs to the roof of the building. It was the tallest skyscraper in Santon at about 550 feet. Only the observation tower was higher, but getting onto the roof of that structure was impossible for two conspicuously robed figures. It was easy enough to flash some charm badges and keep the building's security and worker bees unaware of their presence. If they had to parkour up the side of a building, there wasn't enough magic in the world to make the entire population of the city ignore or forget such a sight. Or block all the cell phones snapping pictures and uploading videos. The lack of such media on the internet was a testament to the level-headedness of most practitioners of magic. The setting of their meeting was an inconvenience that suborned the two hegemony wizards. The Prosperous was a paranoid, conservative Luddite who maintained that his inefficacy with technology was the result of his considerable magic and not his own stubborn remoteness. He could have picked up a phone, but such simplicity was beneath him and his communiques. He never had frivolities for mid-level magicians such as Johann and Alana. He would not fraternize nor allow any of his immediate subordinates to cater to anything but his own whims. It was an impressive display, though. He dropped out of the sun. He hadn't transformed into a phoenix. He merely adopted the appearance of the mythical creature, his totem or spirit animal. He merged with the magical energy that made up the shape of the creature and flew at the speed of light. The Prosperous landed and the magic wrapped around his body into a robe that was the range of yellow and red hues that composed the flame. The fiery red feathers receded into gray, wiry hair around a skullcap that almost covered his bald spot completely. A widow's peak had once given the impression of a sort of beak on the top of his skull, but that had been gone for decades. He saw no reason to distort any of the signs and lines age had etched into his face or scorched on the crown of his head. He was many things, but not shallow. Prosperous, the two wizards greeted their leader. Johann bowed and Alana attempted her best, most practiced curtsy. The mistakes in the gesture were quickly apparent with some crinkles and dips in her clothing, but the boss didn't seem to notice. His gaze was never directly on them. In his presence one got the sense that his attention was elsewhere. He was likely scrying a number of other locations and pondering any number of other magical quandaries. He was beyond manners. Beyond being rude. I will not take up too much of your time, Magi. Your work in this region has not gone unrecognized. The hegemony views your progress as commendable. If you keep to your tasks, you both can expect promotion and future access to greater secrets, the Prosperous said. Thank you kindly, Prosperous, Johann cut in before Alana could respond. They only coincidentally spoke in unison. It was a silly tradition that she felt she'd left behind, but he always threw her for a loop when he would participate in the schoolyard practice, until he didn't. Like now. Your kind words are appreciated, Prosperous, Alana said. There was no change in his demeanor like there had been with Johann's response. If anything, she thought he regarded the remark as an interruption. You have not been the sole stabilizing presence in South Texas, however. The mercenary magician, Vic Fender, has been dealing with the more egregious threats to the balance. Even though he handles objectives we would not sanction or recommend you pursue, we are not blind to the effects of his work. He has recently optioned a Deca division contract, the Prosperous said, the dripping disappointment in his words filling his glass by the end of his speech. He has a way of getting jobs out from under us. Like you have said, most of these are beneath our operations, but this cannot be entirely unexpected, Alana said. We do not have the resources to be more proactive in our pursuit of magical threats, I'm sure you'll agree, Johann added. Alana was surprised to hear his support and she let it show for a few seconds. This is not a meeting for the airing of grievances or the making of suggestions. Now is not the time for such things. I have an objective for you too, he said. We are yours to command, Prosperous, the two of them responded, this time in unison. Our divination committee deemed this Deca contract as of the highest priority. Whatever the outcome, whether it be Fender's failure or unqualified success, it represents a potential shift in the region beyond what the hegemony would deem acceptable. As the highest-ranked representatives in the area, you must monitor its progress, the Prosperous commanded. How should we proceed, Prosperous? Alana asked. You have your orders, Magus, he responded. Must we exercise our discretion in this matter, is what she's wondering, Prosperous. Johann asked. We appreciate the trust your vagueness would belie. We simply do not wish to step out of bounds. You are familiar with the orthodoxy. You have served the hegemony admirably. You have our trust to handle the matter. The goal is lasting stability. I recommend that you refrain from antagonizing or eliminating rogue elements unless absolutely necessary. It would be ideal for these elements to be brought into the fold. But if that were easy or likely, the Prosperous did not finish. The two lesser mages bowed and the Prosperous summoned to him the energy necessary to depart in the same fashion he arrived. All that was left in his wake was a large case. Some interpretations of magic and practices paid more mind to the letter of the law rather than the spirit. The hegemony strove to be very thorough and precise in its administration, but a Shakespearean intolerance of lawyers and equivocation had been present since their many ancient and modern conflicts with the denizens of the Fey realms. As a result of this prejudice, it was typical for elder wizards to micromanage the activities and efforts of their inferiors. Mind magic facilitated this, although the younger generations regarded this as an intrusion. In the rare case such as this where the hegemony's agents were granted a large degree of autonomy, tradition dictated that tokens of esteem were given to the acting magicians. Johann removed his robes for the trip down the elevator and back into the mundane world faster than Alana, and so he made it to the case first. Inside were many baubles and trinkets that would make their efforts slightly easier. A few batteries of magical energy. Some business cards for individuals to contact for a number of trivialities that would occupy their time if not entirely distract from their mission. As well as the case itself. It was not unwieldy but could contain more than you might guess from a casual examination. Johann's robe folded itself and settled in one of the slots easily. Alana's gown did as well. Too useful an investiture would mean the commander didn't believe the Magi could be successful in the task without considerable support. There was nothing more than time savers so far as Alana and Johann were concerned. As such, the items were tacit verification of the Prosperous belief in their suitability for the task, if not his outright trust. They took the elevator down the skyscraper and headed to their black, heavily tinted SUV. Chapter 18. Fine print. Vic had to examine the terms of the contract before putting pen to paper. Most supernatural shows aren't too far off about how the Moonlit Society operates. At one time wizards were more prominent at courts and as counselors. Mankind's suspicion of the supernatural meant a healthy distrust of letting them have any more power beyond their own striated society. Few heads of state were acknowledged magic users. Humanity's world is out in the open, under the sun. Magicians, monsters, demons, and fairies is dimly illuminated by moonlight. The moon and the sun may concurrently occupy the sky at certain points in the day, but when the sun does shine it's brighter. It can't be day and night at the same time, And so the supernatural societies must step aside or get burned by the sun. So it goes as to why it's a bad idea for any supernatural being to try and take charge. There is a lot more normal humans than there are any of the monsters. Each time some crazy wizard got enough clout to cast a big enough spell to make enough of a statement as to why everyone should fall into line, it's not that something stops him. It's that he succeeds and the world pushes back. You can't study magic enough to get good and have enough time to learn business administration or law or computer information systems. Rome didn't fall in a day. But the biggest civilizations get too big and too tempting for anyone with power to try and assert dominance. This fighting over the scraps, because it's always just scraps, does a good job to speed things along towards oblivion. And the dawning of a new era or age. There's a reason why demons go after small towns. A carpet bombing can ruin all their plans. Not even a nuke. Just a run-of-the-mill carpet bombing. You don't even need a pilot now if you have a drone do the trick. The rules have changed for everyone. Even after all this time, all the technology, wizards were still here. They're everywhere because the same things that draw bad juju draws whatever lights the spark of magical ability. The halls of power recognized their utility and always had important ventures blessed. There's always money put aside for unforeseen expenses. And as such there's plenty of business jargon woven into the contract that Vic couldn't just take to a lawyer. He would receive a per diem. He could contract help. He couldn't go to the media. Or the authorities. And Vic had to keep it legal. Failure to do so would forfeit his claim to reimbursement. Charges might be filed. I've read enough, Ms. Montez. You've really got me clipped here, Vic said. She looked at him curiously and he pointed to the line on the document. It was in a mystical language that appeared as gibberish to a mundane. Like the Voynich manuscript. Or like a Rube Goldberg device. Those contraptions of magical engineering look like ridiculous frivolities to regular humans. You can follow their design to perfectly craft very useful baubles. Of course this had slipped Vic's mind thanks to her accommodating demeanor. I gotta keep this on the up and up, Vic said and waved a hand over the document. The surface formed waves like a pool of water and when they settled, Montez could read it. No cops. No media. Gotta stay out of trouble or else I'll wind up in a ditch somewhere and in a few centuries they'll be sending another jack-off like me to deal with my returned form. So what's your plan? She asked. Vic don't know why he felt so gregarious. She had that air about her. That she could get you talking. He could see how it'd get her to seal the deal with the holders of mineral rights. At least they were on the same side. Unless she was trying to get contracted for it. She had to be getting paid for her time already. I picked up a relic from a trip in Mexico, Vic said and took out a locket clasped around an unidentifiable chunk of something. Got some good karma on my side. But even if you have a silver bullet, you still need a gun to fire it, he continued, unsure of what other pieces of the puzzle would be needed. Can you get silver bullets? Will those do anything? She asked. Bless her heart, we're not dealing with vampires or werewolves here. Plus silver bullets aren't very useful. They'd be annoyances to any real threat. A high enough concentration of silver makes for a shitty bullet. Vic said. Dust is useful. A molecular formula of silver and some other thing would dilute the effectiveness. And, like I said, demons, it doesn't sound like you have a shot. Why sign on if you don't know a way out? She asked. It was a good question. That's the kind of guy I am, I guess. Die young. Leave a beautiful corpse, he said. You're none of those things. And you're old enough that you shouldn't be dispensing cliches instead of having an actual personality, she said. And she was right. I'll need to identify the demon. Do some recon at the dig site. In the past that'd be returning to the scene of the crime, but there are a lot more comfortable lodgings than oil field offices. Do they keep the housing on site? Vic asked. No. Not when the boom towns pop up and does the work for us. Part of the deal. Like in Jersey how you can't pump your own gas. You gotta let everyone make money, she answered. Then there shouldn't be too many of them hanging out around the hole. Of course there will be a few trying to cross over, but I should be able to handle those. I'll need to interrogate a few, he said. How do you interrogate a demon? She asked. Holy waterboarding is a good thing to do. If you can stop short of melting a demon's face off. Which is a lot easier than drowning a terrorist, Vic responded. It's the same as an exorcism, but rather than banishing it back from whence it came, you demand its service. Then it's a matter of turning on it before it turns on you. You've done this before, plenty of times. I need its true name. Someone's bound to know it. It might be on the walls of its prison. If a group of shamans was responsible for locking him down there in the first place, they had to know it, he said. The place wasn't a hotbed of Karankawa or Apache activity, she responded. A big enough baddie would get them together, Vic said, ignoring her failure to mention the other tribes that held the central Texas foothills. I should come with you. Just to sign off on the expense report. You talk a good game, but we're not too different when it comes to business, she said. It's the first requirement when trying to get something out of someone for next to nothing. Oh, I was hoping for the company. You're just going to have to clean it up, he said. Clean what? She demanded. Newbies have very specific reactions the first time they see such things as imps or demons. Gets messy real quick, Vic said knowingly. Chapter 19, Boomtown. There was more driving north from Bernie to get to Pena. Vic's part of deep South Texas was relatively flat, save for the farthest west end of El Valle. A few hours north on 281, things change. As flat as most of Texas is, the sudden appearance of hills is quite jarring. A big river. Big mounds of dirt and rock. It's almost as if nature is saying, keep out. And when you had to go up these places by foot or by horse, the message was sent. A lot of magic folk see the roads and rail as wounds that have carved up the land and have been some offense to nature. Of course, when you can exhaust the fun of something like the Grand Canyon in about 10 minutes, you realize that something has changed about us. Whether or not it's for the better, it's made things a whole lot easier. Nature isn't a spurned lover or ignored parent. You can't offend her. That's like a child thinking he could take his teacher in elementary school. Bullies don't pick on the big ones. Sure, if there's a shrimpy piece of shit, or a sweet old lady, they'll jump. But in that they're going to swarm, not take it one-on-one. Nature is not a sweet old lady. She has a plan for men. The crust is her dead skin and we are the dust mites. And man is not alone in his harvesting. Look at how carrion birds divvy up a carcass. Look how rodent builders or burrowers make as much a mess as one town. We can't offend nature. We've infected it and sooner or later it will cure us. Cure itself. Some argue that is what demons were, at one time at least. A part of that cure. Some of them are convinced that they still are spiritual antigens given form to remove a fleshly infection. The average human being's deference to any spirit is proof enough of their superiority. They prey upon our weakness, our vice. They're like those carrion birds drawn to spiritual decay, so that they might repurpose it into something worthy. Our Western traditions dictate that they are out to get us, that they take things personal. Many do. If they didn't have some place in the scheme of things, they wouldn't be here. Some are good at their jobs. You don't have to enjoy your job to do it well, but it helps. Texas is rich with oil. The easy-to-reach Texas tea was already spoken for and sipped up. It took a long time to get at it, when you considered the history of the world. As fast as we could suck it out of the straw, we'd drink. All that's left is the gunky mixture of earth and oil called shale. Tar sands. Think of the last sip of coffee or tea. You got a gross mixture of grit and stimulants. It's easier to toss it out. But the stuff at the bottom of your cup of joe doesn't drive your car. A caliche road had been constructed to get to the site from the farm to market road that Vic and Montez had to take off the highway. The end of the year rains made the nearly 2-lane road almost impossible to get across. These roads used to be mainly for tractors and now primarily conveyed 18-wheelers with large tanks of petrochemicals. Without the industry there would be nothing, but for the odd travelers like Vic and Montez it wasn't ideal. You could be stuck behind a tractor trailer for hours until the road would curve and you could see if the path was clear for you to pass it. The drivers were monitored, so they had to keep to a specific speed and were limited in their stops, but it was still easy to be a passive-aggressive driver. With the tax breaks for the industry due to its dominance, the roads were worn down and into perpetual disrepair. Every few hundred miles there'd be roadwork equipment and even less of a shoulder. The two of them couldn't go very fast on the caliche. It wasn't flat, but ribbed, drying mud everywhere, created by the large truck tires. Montez had insisted on driving in her F-350. She was skilled enough driver. Vic's old Range Rover would have probably gotten stuck or broken down out here, but with a few magical augmentations of his reaction time and perception he would have been able to speed through the worst of it. It was easy to internalize magic and increase your bodily functions. Healing is the most obvious, but being stronger, faster, or sexier was also possible. The right words or calligraphy, tattoo, or chunk of endangered species could do the trick. There was a cost afterwards. Increased appetite. Burnout. Injury. Bad luck. If you were prepared, you could sleep it off, but if not, you could get yourself or the recipient of the enchantment killed. It also felt good. As much spell slinging as Vic had been doing, it was easier to let her drive and try to sleep. Less than 10 or 15 minutes of spouts of conversation and awkward silence would have been golden. Montez was one of those things Vic didn't believe existed. A dyed-in-the-wool liberal member of the oil industry. No doubt the conflict she felt raping and pillaging the land, as well as the constant slings of her co-workers, forced her to double down on the lefty thing. Lacking as he did a stable base of operations, Vic wasn't registered, himself. Thanks to a mix-up, he was, for a time, a non-voting felon. But the governor made good on his promise of a pardon after some work Vic did for a cousin of his maternal grandfather, twice removed. Vic didn't really get to pay attention to the goings-ons of the political world in his line of work. Vic was one of those everyone pisses me off types, and it was easy to bury himself in his job of fighting demons and the like while the mundanes carried their own bullshit, figurative crusades. He probably was on her side on 60% of things, but it just wasn't his favorite subject to talk about. And sure, there wasn't as bad a deficit when you don't count the war. Montez insisted with a finger wag before she came to a quick stop. The brakes seized and they skidded sideways, taking up both lanes for several hundred feet. A tanker truck was on its side in front of them. It looked like for some reason it made too sharp a turn and it tipped over. When Vic realized what was happening, time seemed to slow. If you've been in a wreck, you've felt this. It's not magic, just instinct. Vic had been in plenty of close calls, so he almost robotically started railing off some prayers of good fortune. Montez's truck spun a few times and stayed on the road. The prayers were answered. They stopped short of plowing sideways into the tanker. Vic's door was right against the giant chrome jug. The rear view mirror hadn't been damaged, merely knocked and folded in. These big trucks often are a pain to fit into regular-sized garages. We'll have to walk the rest of the way. And I'll need to get out of your door, he said. She got off and moved about slowly, trying to avoid the patches of mud that would try to swallow her pumps. After she let Vic off, she rethought her strategy and put on some cowboy boots she had in the back seat of her truck. Even though Vic was a natural-born Texan, the boots were never his thing. His black work boots did the trick. And were quite comfortable. Never underestimate the importance of comfortable shoes in magic. He thought. They had the first clue. This getaway rig that the driver lost control of. Vic started looking around. How can we tell if this is full of gas or not? He asked. Out here it won't be gas. It'll be oil. There should be a meter. She looked around a bit and pointed. This is where you'd fill it up. There's no stopper or cap. It probably has a negligible amount. Otherwise it'd have spilled out, so they got out in a hurry. Didn't make it far. Vic glanced around some more. There were tracks up the road and then into the bush. They weren't here for survivors, though. He looked closer at the tank. There were claw marks at various parts. Probably imps. They'd used the ladders and held onto handles, but some had probably been shaken loose and tried to cling to the sides. There were some of their cloven marks on the ground too. The word imp can interchangeably refer to a certain breed of demon or their rank. It's not a formal distinction. Great chthonic forces predated existence and only lived at the top of the shit pile. These primeval forces might be injured or slough off their skin, so to speak, and from these bits and that blood minor versions of them spring into existence. They often lack individuality, they rarely develop beyond their urges. When they do, they gain the ability to feed on others of their own kind to grow, but rare has any climbed from this gestational stage to such heights that they might challenge their creator. Corrupted spirits are similarly single-minded, but the process by which they deviate from their expressed purpose means they also leapfrog this stage, having likely intermingled and subsumed other demons already. The greater demons and spirits relish in their power, the more they align with the Platonic ideal of their nature. The height to which some can dare aspire is to set themselves up at the center of some place where their vice is the central indulgence. But they can also deviate from this unnatural progression, and so some decline advancement to higher forms. A non-corporeal form bound more easily to a mortal host, through symbiosis or outright possession, then emerge from the void as the devourer of worlds. Imps like these are more like animals escaping from a zoo. They are unaware of their potential, although if they don't totally involve themselves in consumption they could eventually come to understand their nature and powers. Most of a demon's existence is mindless devotion to fulfilling their urges. Those that move past this to some semblance of individuality don't last very long, as they continue to overindulge. Unlike your average high school student, they don't get to grow out of this phase. Those who are bound to warlocks have a better chance of a lengthy, important existence because they pick up some arcane knowledge from their prison warden. These are still a considerable minority, as most warlocks mistreat their servants and then ravage their form to extract the last bit of energy. It's not a zero-sum game. They cannot efficiently regain what it took to summon it, and the process of binding demons eventually taints a mortal soul enough to make one indistinct from those they exploit. Service usually comes after, to a bigger, badder demon. This wasn't entirely a bad idea. Deals with demons were rarely worthwhile. Have you seen anything like this before? Montez asked. Plenty of times. When I was going through puberty, me and my boys learned what a succubus was, Vic answered. Weird things happened around us, and we hadn't narrowed down who was special. Except for those of us on the short bus. Sounds like some of your friends are in the oil business, she replied. I assume you summoned a sexy demon and had an unholy orgy. I wished, Vic said. We weren't able to summon one so much as find one at an abandoned building. We trapped it easy enough, and it kind of looked like a woman. That was enough for old Greg. Almost got his dick bit off. So you found the right one yet? Montez asked. He shook his head and kept looking around. Why not? She asked. It's easy enough to explain. Conventional wisdom states that any demons that can serve are not powerful enough to offer any knowledge that can't be attained elsewhere, and those that can are too powerful to be controlled. Dominating destructive imps to use them like portable flamethrowers is one thing, but they won't be able to teach you about controlling magical fire. Just as all wizards had to study at the feet of the experts and masters, when you become some kind of demon/human hybrid and are set on that path, in order to fully realize one's magical potential, you have to learn from someone who's been down that path before, Vic said. If you were alive in the 80s you'd think all it took was a Judas Priest ticket, Montez said. Schools of infernalism had a habit of getting burnt to the ground by angry townsfolk. Which complicated things since you had to go to someone who's been in the demon game for a while. They don't automatically screw over their help, especially if their help is competent. But it's a fine line between help, student, and competition. It's no surprise that these devils are in no hurry to promote their interns. At the same time, if too much resentment builds from a lack of development or instruction, betrayal might come from the other side of things. A demon gains some of the knowledge and power of whatever it consumes, be it the blood of a mortal or the essence of another demon. It's very Sith master and apprentice, Vic said, and Montez nodded. Vic looked into the cab of the truck. The door was closed, but hadn't sealed too tightly. You could wiggle it and pull it open if you tried hard enough. It was probably left open and closed by the wind. It was a new truck. A nice one. You could live in here pretty comfortably until you wondered why at your age and that point in your life your house had fucking wheels and you weren't living on the ground like a normal fucking human being. There were a few cracks in the windows and bullet-shaped holes all over the vehicle and in some of the trees. Montez confirmed that the tanker, itself, had some dents that indicated bullet fire. Shooting guns at an oil rig. Stupid and desperate. Seems about right, Vic thought. He had plenty of friends who were teachers. They would regale him with stories about the holy terrors they faced. Frequently these stories centered around the kind of kids who thought the exit ticket to the shitty lives they've earned by way of teen pregnancy, truancy, dropping out, and government assistance would be the oil fields. It was money and time away from your baby mama and screaming brats. All because you didn't go to class, didn't wear a bag, or wanted to get high. The desperate driver of this truck didn't seem to know what they were doing. It wasn't out of first gear and the parking brake was still on. There was a bloody piece of rebar on the seat. It was dry and stuck to the upholstery. Human blood. Vic touched it and closed his eyes. Psychometry is something that's innate in many untrained magic users, but many leave it behind when they start majoring in blowing shit up. It's a handy skill, but you actually have to ignore a lot of your instincts when utilizing it if you want to get good information. Like if someone was told to make a fist, most would wrap their fingers around their thumb. If they popped someone, and did it well, they'd break their thumb. Similarly, if you close your eyes it's hard enough to be a blank slate. Your thoughts go wherever they will, usually to the things that most concern you. The questions you want answered. Since it's your headspace, you'll get the answers you want to be true rather than the ones you know are true. The not always self-fulfilling prophecy that is racial profiling is another analogy. Most can't center themselves. Stillness is a prerequisite for this psychic practice, but its use makes you vulnerable to possession. Transcendental meditation doesn't, despite what the religious might think. You're like a turtle going into its shell. Right now, Vic was a blank slate for someone to do some automatic writing on, and then he would have to read that writing. There was the chance that it could be something that Vic shouldn't say out loud or think. Because of the danger inherent watching the scary movie for too long, Vic could only indulge a montage of the events. There were few flashpoints. A loud boom distinct from the combustion of the chemicals being sucked from the earth. A low squeak that became deafening, like a cloud of bats passing overhead. Lots of questions and confusion. Then screams. Twisted faces of the possessed. Bodies being tackled and feasted upon. A few survivors, like the driver of this truck who didn't do Vic the favor of looking in a mirror. She fought off a few of the possessed with the rebar. He couldn't see any physical signs of possession, so at first it just seemed as though the defenders were the crazy ones. Until the imps showed up, Montez shook Vic from his reverie. He rubbed his temples. He felt the effects from his lack of good sleep, and his magic use was particularly draining. "You okay?" she asked, holding a medium-sized revolver. "I'm good." There were a lot of them. "Let me see that," Vic said, pointing to her gun. She had the look of, "from my cold dead hands," at first, but he waved her on hurriedly. And she let him have it. Vic touched the rebar and the blood stain and then drew some sigils with his finger on the weapon. "There. You'll have to get it looked at after tonight, but you should be good for ammo that'll be worth a damn against evil things if we run into any." "What are you talking about?" she asked and started looking at the gun. The red marks glowed slightly and then dissipated. This was actually the first sign of magic she'd seen and wanted to disbelieve it. Were the two of them not so close to the ancient, earthen tomb of a great demon, she might have dispelled the Vic's incantation unconsciously. "I can't whip up a magic wand that can shoot cleansing blasts of holy light for you that easy, unless you were still a virgin," Vic said, and Montez shook her head. Getting harder and harder to find folks who survived their 20s with their V card unpunched. "I don't suppose you had about half a gallon of holy water or a National Day of Prayers serving of communion wafers in your truck." Montez shook her head again and Vic took a deep breath. "Then we'll have to make do. It's not easy for most, but for someone like me it's possible to repurpose a weapon like this and all its destructive components into something effective against demons. The bullets are inert now, but the small bit of combustible powder now powers the contraption to shoot bursts of sanctified blood at the demons." Vic pointed to where the now absent stain had been. "It's not so much that it's holy, but the victims of these creatures can now be implored to lend some of their desire for revenge into something that can achieve that effect." She looked at Vic confused, but an appropriate analogy escaped him. Vic reluctantly peered into the spirit world. This was the aftermath of a prison riot. Most of the big guns had moved down the road, occupied Peña to gather their strength or seek shelter. But there was plenty of carrion and vermin here that had to be dealt with before Vic could seek out those monsters. The big guy was still buried deep, dormant. He was asleep, but he'd stir. His children would grow in power and bait him from hibernation if Vic and Montez didn't find out what was going on. When you look into the spirit realm, you can see everything in it and they can see you. While not literally what Nietzsche referred to when he spoke of the abyss, of monsters, depending on the translation, it was close enough. Chapter 20. The difference between a void and an abyss. It was dark, but the previous night's rain clouds had passed. The sky was full of stars and a bright moon. It wouldn't be enough to see everything, but the darkness wasn't a problem. Flashlights or tech would not work as well as magical night vision for the sake of perception and stealth. It was easy enough for Vic to give Montez a bauble that augmented her vision and gave her something of the second sight. The oil derrick was about half a mile from the crash. There were actually two separate structures. A traditional large metal tower with the appropriate scaffolding at one end, and another, similar enough to the layman but distinct in several key ways. The designs weren't that different from the earliest oil wells. There was an enormous water tank near the fracking derrick. This would be pumped into the ground, to force the oil mixture up and out of the crust for refinement. It used to be easy to romanticize oil. Not long after railways girded the West, it became oil country. There were still ranches, trucks, and rodeos, but most grown-up, worn-down cowboys worked on the oil fields. Roughnecks are as integral part of country music, and they're hard-drinking, truck-driving men who don't live in the modern world, they only visit. Before 2 wars, tar balls, and Dick Cheney. Magicians don't push a more reasonable bullshit about the gunk underground that starts all those wars. Some say it's the blood of dragons or demons, long dead and gone. Their leavings and remains now giving men some of their power over the skies, over the land. If you include dinosaurs in your definition of dragons, they're not too far off. It was the fuel of the modern age and the corrupting miasma that was killing and fueling killing. Or it was the lifeblood of the earth itself. There were theories with plenty of junk science that claimed oil was a sort of renewable resource from deep below the surface. No magician has thought to go below the surface and find out. Eventually, the crust is solid and impenetrable to even astral forms. Once you dispense with the fairy tales and pay mind to the science, oil's not as interesting as any of that. It's combustible hydrocarbons at the center of our world. It's the industry, and it's the way of modern life. Not just for automobiles, but for manufacturing plastics too. It's probably going to run out soon, like beer or Coke at the party. None of that concerned Vic. Not while he was out here, hunting demons. There was a fissure between the 2 derricks that looked exactly like how you'd imagine a portal to hell would look. A crack in the ground's flesh that went down farther than you could see or even imagine in daylight. A geologist might delight at the curious and unprecedented layers of the Earth's crust, but the infernal nature of the landmark meant that it was not very useful to natural science. There would have been no way to examine the foulness scientifically before there was need for alarm. The magic that permeated the area bedeviled delicate scientific instruments. The recent dominance of pseudoscience in popular culture ensured that the slightest talk of the supernatural might get you a spot on the History Channel, but at the cost of your reputation as a true scholar. The hole seemed infinitely deep and dark. Except when something crackled like lightning from the veins of magma that would spark into balefire. There was of course the haze of the oil's fumes as well, which the sparks often ignited. The fissure moaned and growled. If you listened closely, you might hear the slumbering murmurs of the ancient still contained in the ground. Some Mephistophelian chorus or monologue. Vic's recent encounter with the Satanist in Mexico left him sensitive to the demonic energies that radiated in this place. Right now his soul and consequently his whole body stung with the tenderness of a sunburn that had not yet healed. The area felt cool, as though there was a lack of circulation, but also consumptive and still painful. His spirit had been singed of a layer of protection, and now in the presence of such infernal heat Vic was further subjected to suffering inherent with the confrontation of true darkness. It would take time to heal. He had not yet been able to purify himself, and this job took Vic closer to damnation, not purification. Not that he was unfamiliar with the prospect of losing his soul. He used dark energy as regularly as he did divine and arcane. Eternal damnation would not be a complete 180 for him. Vic regularly bound demons to service. They frequented the places that were permeated with human misery. A typical job for Vic would be the cleanup of these places. The task predicated a deep cleansing of the area, the complete and total removal of that foul energy along with the regular filth. Killing all the demons wouldn't be enough, and Vic didn't have the gentle nature necessary to heal such a wound, by himself. Healers didn't have to be pure, but they did have to use purer methods and energies to achieve their aims, and a degree of faith or magnanimity made it that much easier. Consequently, such an individual wouldn't have the stomach or talent for extermination. Vic usually wouldn't kill all the minor demons he encountered. If you trapped one in a circle or incapacitated it, you could mark it with your sigil and give it orders. Demons were useful spies and catspaws. Betraying them when their service was complete, rather than freeing them, was not the dispensing of divine justice and still was a stain on his own soul. So far he avoided doing anything that would be permanently corrupting. Vic never did evil for evil's sake. It was always the means. Never the end. Is what he told himself, at least. He still had a soul to sell. To lose. It would only hurt a little and then he would have so much power. A trained magician like Vic would far outstrip Papa Muerte with infernal investiture. If he was reasonable about it, he could become a prince of the depths. Because the great devils are always so reasonable. In his reverie and preparations, Vic hadn't noticed so much of the gore. There were dismembered bodies almost picked dry. Several piles of bones that had been broken. The marrow sucked out. Relatively little viscera or flesh. The imps had been thorough as vultures. Vic spent some time on a ranch, so he just told myself he was used to the gore. He almost believed it. Most of the bits didn't even look human. It didn't smell worse than an abattoir right after closing time, but before everything had been hosed off. He threw up in his mouth a couple of times, but not enough to be unable to swallow it back down. Until the next time, Montez was not so desensitized to the presence of such evil. And so much death. She was shaking. She knew some of these people. Hopefully she wouldn't find a name tag. Dental records wouldn't serve any purpose at the moment. Buck up, Montez. It's terrible, the worst. But if you mope, you're going to draw them out. Vic said. Who? She asked, and soon she saw all. The derrick's emergency light came back on. Or rather, the imps had been covered by the nesting imps. They ranged in size from kitten to puppy to fat baby. Despite the diminutive stature, they were quick and had sharp claws, horns, and teeth. She instinctually raised her weapon and fired. The behavior was in her muscle memory, and she had known not to point when you weren't going to shoot. She hit 6 of them and had to stop herself from reloading when the 7th shot flew out of the barrel and hit the last of her immediate targets. When she felt her weapon not getting lighter with the expensive ammunition, she continued, shooting another 20. Bullets were expensive. All her training and practice up to now had cost her a pretty penny. With Vic's help she could fight evil the way God intended an American. Vic had left out the price of Montez's use of her weapon. It would be ruined when the sun came up, and she would be upset. He hadn't expected her to shoot so well and hit so many demons. It wasn't merely the energy from the gunpowder or the spirits that powered the weapon, but it was also the little spark of creation that she had, that all humans have. Made in the image of their creator as they were, the spark doesn't allow everyone to become a practitioner, but when harnessed through prayer or stubborn determination it can achieve world-changing effects. It's a component of groupthink, the magnetism between pieces of a mob that make them all guilty of the crimes committed and no one of directly responsible. Any worthwhile endeavor is taxing. Difficult. Ultimately sustaining, but you have to get through the tunnel of all that wasted, inefficient effort. Vic had thought to funnel some of Montez's soul energy in their task. Her bullets wouldn't be effective if he hadn't. But she was a fucking fire hydrant right now. The muzzle flare was merely the magical spark and the cleansing fuel came from within. Eventually it would run out. She was killing them faster than Vic was with his wand. He preferred to use a staff for battle magic. He had a nice piece of petrified wood with his magical thesis written on it in sigils, or used to. He lost it and had been reduced to using his backup, a smaller, shorter piece of petrified wood which got the job done but was a weaker device the length of a yardstick. The problem was compounded because he was not using the object for its intended magical purpose. She didn't run out of bullets, but she did feel a sudden loss of energy and that resulted in a loss of balance. Vic knew the feeling of spiritual exhaustion all too well and held out his arm. She landed on it, and barely was able to brace herself and stay standing. Wow, we got a lot of them right. She asked, even though she knew she did most of the work. Yeah, we made a big enough statement, Vic answered. The rest will go back into the fissure. Maybe back to hell. They weren't worried about us, though. They were scared of what we woke up. What? She asked, but she heard it. Heard them. Whereas the imps could best be described as wingless bats, the 6 monsters that emerged from the various bolt holes of the rig were the pretty standard winged demon. The likes of which you'd see on a death metal album or tattooed on douches trying to advertise to everyone in their immediate area that a fight was happening somewhere soon. Those were the rodents. Picking at the scraps. They could have overwhelmed us, but you routed them. Good shooting. Now the real fun, you still up for it? Vic asked. She tried to stand on her own power, but she couldn't raise the sight of her gun at the circling fiends. They were picking at the fleeing imps, and soon they'd have their fill of bread and head for the 2 of them, the entree. These fiends were still animals, for the most part. Their ability to fly and their speed meant that they could prey on lesser beings quite easily and didn't need to develop beyond that purpose. In a way they were fairly resilient and somewhat incorruptible. They were destructive, yes, but they served similar functions to the bats, eagles, or vultures they appeared as. Those that fed on more insidious prey actually took on a nobler appearance of a griffin or chimera. Those who strayed from their task, fell under the sway of something awful, or developed a taste for other white meat grew twisted. There wasn't anything that looked like the noble steed that would serve Vic faithfully. These were angry, hungry, twisted beasts. They'd likely gotten their fill on the workers before making their nests. Demons, like angels, are genderless. They're Ken and Barbie down there until they become corrupt. Even the spirits of lust, with their look but don't touch thing going on, inspired cold showers and grown-up feelings down there until they decided to be involved in more than mere titillation. This results in your run-of-the-mill succubi and incubi, who possess humans and can warp their bodies or birth something twisted. And are delights at parties. These demons were twisted into bestial corruptions of birds of prey as a result of their consumption of human quarry. They resented their quarry and harvested their food with impunity and anger. They became animalistic as a result of shedding some of their original purpose and now sought to do what any predator would do. Feed and then breed. We have to kill them and clear out their nests. Or else people will be reporting chupacabras and Mothmen for years, Vic said. Is that where these stories come from? She asked, reaching into her messenger bag for something. Not all of them. A coyote with a skin disease looks like a monster. But just enough of them are real. And it's not an unmanageable threat except that those kinds of beasts would make wonderful pets for the big guy when he wakes up, and the ones who are holding the town, Vic said. He looked at her while she was fishing through her bag. What are you looking for? I need some pep. I don't normally indulge, but when you work late nights in lonely records departments, she said and produced a vial of white powder. Oh, so you party? Vic asked, but she ignored him and took a bump. Life returned to her and she didn't need to support herself on anything. Let's take those fuckers down. She reflexively cleared the chamber of the unspent bullet. She was fast, but the fiends were able to dodge her shots. When they heard the hammer of her weapon click back, they swooshed slightly to the side and the blast of energy simply wheezed by. Pinche putos y cabrones, Montez spat as she refrained from firing into the air. Her frustration was released by the curses and was able to keep a cool head, even under the influence. Her training would override the spray and pray instinct and she watched the creatures fly overhead. She didn't have any of the revulsion to them. The drugs did well to steel her nerves, and there'd be a hell of a come down waiting. I can't hit one. How do we stop those fuckers? She asked, trying to get one of them in her sights and failing. Vic looked at their flight pattern. They moved fast, but not unbelievably so. When threatened or near a carcass, they could blink from where they were to safety or to their target instantly. It was a trick Vic had been aware of but hadn't known that was the province of these demons. It meant they'd have to get closer. I'm going to let one of them get me. As they fight over me, you pick off the ones that fall to the ground. If they don't, I'll be able to stun them and you finish them off as they fall, easy enough. Just don't miss and hit me with some of that shot. Vic almost sounded confident, but his voice was shaky and Montez recognized the nervousness. That doesn't sound very safe, she said. It's our only shot. Just don't miss, he said and jumped out from their cover. Clouds had returned to the sky, which gave Vic his own weapon. They still hadn't perceived him, so Vic waved his wand, writing on the air a storm spell. It hadn't started to rain or thunder, so he had to use some magical energy to augment it, but it was still considerably easier than summoning a whole storm on his own. Tempestus turbido. The fiend sensed the change in the environment and looked for its source. Demons don't have an innate magical sense, save for those experienced with magic users. But anyone would be able to see that someone here sliced open a vein of something, in this case magical energy permeating the area, and shot it into the sky. The most readily available energy was dark magic, and so they sensed the disturbance and were able to easily identify the source. Vic Fender. They descended immediately. Vic got two with a bolt of lightning from the newly embiggened storm clouds. Rather than strike them outright, he had the bolt jump from cloud to cloud and it was like the two demons were runners who hadn't cleared a very real hurdle. It was enough of a pause to give Montez time to fill one of them with bullet holes and for Vic to summon a blast of holy light that shined on them, piercing the cloud and consuming the creature under the weight of divine judgment. The effectiveness of the spell is not incumbent on the holiness of the caster, thankfully, but if any of it shone on Vic, he would have suffered some burns. The divine never hesitated to advertise the impact of their work. 3 of them were left. One had the good sense to flee from the battle outright. Demons were a cowardly lot. Technically immortal, they could still be dispensed by someone like Vic. Or a priest. Or a group of kids who learned about growing up in the process. The prudent demons were worrisome, as those not entirely devoted to vice and instant gratification could grow into something truly worrisome. It wasn't all bad. That meant a job for Vic in the future. You had to find the positive in every bad situation, after all. Vic should have been paying attention. The 2 that remained sensed their self-satisfaction and each grabbed one of them. Vic's natural resilience and warding prevented all but superficial wounds, but the corrupting touch of their claws was quite painful to Montez. The wounds burned and the flesh was cauterized, but rather than blister, dark corruption started to spread from the injury, her skin to necrotized around her bare shoulders. Talons wrapped around the top of her arms delicately, and the points sliced into her skin as the points poked into her. The flesh alternately bubbled like it was being burned and developed pustules of infection that grew into the size of something that would horrify people on YouTube. There was no way of knowing whether or not the wounds were real or illusion. Sometimes it's easier to break one's will than twist their flesh. She was close enough to see the thing she'd been trying to kill and panicked. She screamed and dropped her gun. The fiend caught it and crushed it in its tail. The appendage looked like an alligator's, but was skinnier than a python. The appendage was the same color as the fiend's flesh, a very faded teal. The tail was scaly, whereas the rest of the fiend's body was bony and wrapped in drying, cracked flesh. Its body looked like a malnourished person's, save for the hands and feet that ended in long, sharp talons. As her weapon was mangled, there was a burst of the combustible elements, as well as the dissipation of the enchanting magic. It dropped her and Vic acted as fast as he could. He grabbed the base of the fiend's wings and uttered, "Mandatum novum." The rings on his fingers were consumed in the invocation and blue bands appeared around its limbs. Vic was in control, briefly, and he guided it to break her fall. As they descended, Vic took hold of her and tried to arrange the three of them so that the beast take the worst of it. He let the spell fizzle and cast another one that would cushion their fall. It worked, more or less. The fiend took most of it and the force dispersed its corporeal form into a puff of acrid, sulfurous smoke. Vic landed on his shoulder blade and Montez was on top of him, causing more bruising, dislocations, cracks, and internal injuries. The other fiend was nowhere to be seen. Again, future business. If he survived, Montez rolled off of him, not making things any better. "Is that it?" she asked. "We cleared them out. A few wards and maybe some clergy to bless the place and you should be able to resume drilling after some time," he said, struggling to move. She looked hopeful and helped Vic up. She recognized his pained expression. "Let's get to the business office. There should be a first aid kit. And some other things that might help with the pain," she said. "The bosses will be happy to get back to work. Hillbilly heroin would be good, if you got any of that lying around," he shot back. Eventually they got to the mobile home repurposed into an office. There was plenty of damage. Bullet holes and blood stains. The interior didn't smell very bad. A little musty, but no sign of nesting. "If you get work going again, you'll loosen more of the big guy's bonds and this will not even compare to the hell unleashed." She shook her head. "We're losing money." The directive to deal with the problem came from on high. "Some of the upstarts are looking for any weakness. And the people in charge like to play us off one another. Keeps us from organizing. We still have to deal with the town. The big guy is feeding off the demonic occupation and it will wake sooner or later," Vic said. He sat at the damp couch and tried to center himself, so that he might weave his wounds back together, set the bones, and fend off infection. It wasn't happening fast enough to noticeably improve his disposition. "What do you have to do in Peña?" she asked, checking her phone for a signal. "There are lieutenants serving the slumbering demon. Gaining followers and sacrifices. It needs energy to wake up. Either a slow and steady feed or a big blast. Resuming drilling will weaken his confines further and definitely make his liberation require less energy. We need to get out of here, come back in the morning and pick up some scraps." The walk back to the truck got easier, but when they arrived there wasn't a vehicle there. Just new tire tracks in the mud. Someone had driven off. Maybe a survivor. Maybe a possessed survivor. "Son of a bitch," she said and tried to bring up an app on her phone. "Fuck. No signal. I can't contact OnStar. We'll have to contact someone to get us out of here. Let's head back to the office. Might have to have a camp out," he said and they went back. Vic started to feel like the wheels were spinning in the ground. This had gone more or less according to plan, but there was a foul presence in the air with the toxic fumes. Montez kept checking her phone, but found nothing and Vic knew his was long dead. "I'm still pumped up," she said. "Well, make yourself useful. You know what the standard issue gear looks like. Here. Get me enough pieces and I think I can get a satellite phone working and we can be choppered out of here." "You get it done, you win a prize," Vic said. Whereas she might have objected to the command had she not been coked up, she just went with it and started quickly moving around the station with her flashlight. Now that she'd stopped shooting at things, her body started to recover. The cocaine gave her the expected amount of energy and temporary OCD. She made short work of the task, darting in and out of the room, returning with a different component that was tossed into a pile in the room. When she had picked the expected caches of gadgets, trinkets, and pieces of equipment clean, she started to organize them in piles that didn't make sense to Vic. She would, from time to time, ask Vic if one of the pieces looked useful. Vic didn't appreciate her badgering while he bandaged his wounds. He cleaned them with an antiseptic and some holy water. Certain types of demons and monsters can infect you with their disease if they wound you. You fall off the straight and narrow and boom, you're possessed. Despite his experience with such creatures and a natural resistance to such corruption, he delicately dabbed his wounds. Only after the antisepsis bordered on obsessiveness did he apply the bandages. He didn't exactly live too cleanly, and so if something got in his system, one hangover might give the infection opportunity to thrive and turn Vic into something unlike his normal self. "I think I found something more useful than satellite phones," she said, proud of herself. She shook a flask at Vic. He'd ran out of peroxide, so he took it and used it to clean a few wounds. He helped himself to some. "Don't hog it," she said. Despite her professional demeanor, the bit of coke and whiskey started to turn her into a high school girl again. Who was I to judge? They did the same thing to me, Vic thought. There was a flash at one of the stations we'd hid from the rain in. "How romantic," Montez said. "Just like my first time." "Your first time was with a demon-hunting magician in an office building?" Vic asked. "No. There was just booze and drugs, and someone probably would have gotten themselves killed doing something stupid," she answered with another swig. "You don't strike me as the getting killed type," Vic responded. "You calling me soft? You see how many of those things I took down." She almost spat some of the whiskey at the perceived insult. "No, if I wasn't afraid for my life I'd have been aroused," he answered with a smirk. "Are you afraid for your life now?" she asked, waving the gun at him. He did move his head back at first, but then tried to stay out of the way of the imaginary line of fire that protruded from the barrel. He pushed it aside with his palm and she set the gun down. Montez sat up and started to unfasten the buttons on her blouse. "That was fast," Vic said, tugging at his own shirt without unbuttoning any of the buttons. It didn't come off, so he tried once more after unfastening the top few buttons. "No, pendejo," Montez said, her back turned to him. "My clothes are all wet, and I don't trust you." "How do I know you haven't tried to mind magic me?" "I don't need to." "We got whiskey," he answered. She turned back to him and looked up and down his shirtless body. She nodded and kicked off her boots at him. He dodged them and she unzipped her slacks. After the two of them finished, Montez left to look for a cell signal. As the drugs wore off and shame returned, she was able to sort through the pile and find parts of electronics that had not been completely ruined. "Is that enough?" she asked. "If the repair spell is going to work, it has to look like what it is supposed to be, not just a broken pile of plastic," Vic said, and she didn't argue, just got to assembling the pieces further. Just then Vic's phone vibrated in his pocket. It only rumbled for the equivalent of one ring. Like someone dialed and lost the signal or hung up before the data could be sent to space and then to him. It shouldn't have. You couldn't even get analog roaming out here, and the constant search for signal sapped its battery anyway. Satellite phones and walkie-talkies were how the folks who worked out here communicated with one another. He'd have to check later. It was weird, but not even in the top 15 weird things Vic was dealing with, presently. While she pieced them together, Montez went on about how one of the workers got satellite radio and had it out for the guys, but then he got divorced because he went to a strip club and wound up moving. Vic wasn't paying attention. She wasn't content to nap and he did his best to meditate, but the chatter canceled out the centering sounds of the rain. "I think it's working," she said. "Well, call someone who cares," Vic responded. She swatted at him, a playful gesture even though it stung. Rescue was due in an hour or so. Montez was told that it would take a few days for the company to clean up the rig, and she demanded that she oversee the endeavor. He told her to stall the operation some, and definitely hold off on resuming drilling. Even if his recommendations were ignored, the whole thing would take several days. Maybe a week or two, which was fortunate, because when Vic finally checked his phone he knew he would need a couple of days to get his shit together. Chapter 21. Meat Puppets. It came to Vic while he was sleeping, not comfortably. After the third time he snapped himself awake and saw that he was in the passing lane instead of the right one, he pulled over at a rest area. Bright lights behind him and dim red ones ahead were far enough that it was just a mistake, not an accident. Those procrastinators and workaholics alike were full of shit when they expressed the benefits of the last minute of midnight oil. You have to listen when your body says, enough, especially when you're already magically pushing the limits of the human body. When you're fatigued, you're more vulnerable to screwing up, possession, and suggestion. This rest stop didn't have any amenities. Just a sort of frontage road off the expressway that was lined with 18-wheelers on either side. These are decent enough drop-off points for the items and passengers that aren't exactly legal. They lack those closed-circuit cameras that the more accommodated rest stops had, as well as bathrooms and vending machines. A few other cars were empty, but you could find their owners nearby. Hidden wherever two bodies could hide in flagrante delicto. If you pulled your rig off the road and didn't look too suspicious, you wouldn't be accosted by the state troopers. But patterns were recognized. Just as many folks minded their business as they did call in any questionable activity if it persisted. The Border Patrol also utilized dirigibles at various points this close to the border. They usually weren't posted this far north of the last checkpoint, but it was easy enough to station one if surveillance was deemed necessary. A prostitution ring or regular, frequent drug transactions could do the trick. If you could pay the premium for delivery, you could get whatever you wanted out here and have it all to yourself. Of course, that could be said of any place that was 200 miles from the nearest town. At least in New Mexico, there were those kitschy tourist traps that you could fill up on gas and snacks every couple hours, unless you were driving through there late at night, like Vic was now. When everything was closed and the only thing that was awake was the big guy. There had been some splatters and stains on Vic's clothes from when he was fighting the imps and fiends. He hadn't discarded them immediately. Vic was fairly stingy when it came to any kind of charged or potentially useful magical artifact. Blood and bits of demons, when properly cleansed, have a number of uses. Of course, when you hastily and tiredly drive away from a professional responsibility under the influence of a personal problem, it's easy to get sloppy. He couldn't reach Vic in the fleshlands. The big guy was still asleep, but when Vic drifted into the dreamscape, there he was. It wasn't just the pile of smelly clothes in the back seat. Their destinies intersected, and that created a connection. Like when Satan talks to the characters in a movie before the big fight. Or whatever. "Who are you?" he asked Vic. He looked like a sack of potatoes crossed with a racially indistinct Ed Asner. Skin the color of the dry ground. Long hair at the sides of his temples and over his ears. A patchy beard. Not a mouth so much as a maw that had jagged edges instead of teeth. It was hard to tell if the immense being was sitting or standing. It was slouched backwards. The top part of the pile that included the head and face part of the demon pile leaned in to regard Vic. "I'm Vic. I was hired to put you back to bed," Vic said. "I am asleep. We are asleep. I'm so tired." "Aren't you tired?" he asked in a throaty and thick voice. Like an abusive grandfather who was trying not to be, for now, always. Vic responded. "Who are you? You've been thinking about me since you dealt with those children in Mexico." We had not met. So I figured introductions were in order. "I cannot make it too easy for you, just giving you my name and doing half your job for you," he answered. "You're the big guy. Do you mind if I drive?" I rarely get out. He didn't so much as ask as warn Vic about what was going to happen. The car wasn't his beat-up, barely running clunker. It was a shiny convertible, the likes of which were regularly seen on the History Channel's many shows that weren't about history. He turned the key and set the radio to a station that was playing Jimmy Buffett songs. "If you could just get out and drive, why wait for me? Or the oil folks?" Vic asked. "You are mistaken. I am imprisoned there, to be sure. And I cannot free myself. Your kind must do that for me. But this is the dreamscape, as you call it. We can indulge. I can see why you mortals are so insistent on getting as much of our blood as you babies can drill. This is a nice ride," he said. "Are you going to drive me out to a cornfield and put me in the ground?" Vic asked. "There's no corn grown around here. It'd have to be an orchard. They don't dig up orchards unless there is a freeze. No one would find you for decades. But no. Just a talk. I wanted to be sure if you were set on the course of action laid out for you," he said. "I'm contracted to stop you. I have to stop you." "I will do whatever it is I have to do to stop you," Vic responded. "Of course. This is all set out, as you know. Down this path is your ruin. I do not bother with threats, they're so draining. You have to invest in them your will. Some of your animus. And worst of all, you have to follow through, he went on. Well then don't, Vic said. Oh, I'm not making the threat. I know how this concludes. Both of our ends are on the horizon. To tell you the truth, I welcome it. But I wanted to let you know that if you valued the tricycle jaunt you mortals call life, it might be preferable to face the uncertain consequences of an existence as an oathbreaker instead of the coming end. I've accepted what comes to me, but you have a habit of fighting against it. You might just prefer a few extra days. Months. Maybe even a whole fucking year, he said. You get me, big guy. But you must realize that I stopped shirking my responsibilities when I got my GED, went back to college, and started being a grown-up, Vic responded. I have no desire to rise. I have accepted my punishment, and the nature of the infestation you mortals have unleashed is so great because parts of me, my kin and my children do not feel as though what has happened to the rebels was entirely just. They've lost themselves to their appetites and anger. To some degree, I have as well. I am quite comfortable in my own filth down there, he said. It sounded convincing. But he also sounded like Vic's own grandfather, and that man terrorized all of the children in Vic's family. You learned quickly not to speak up or counter him. Great. So I'll just get the company to pour all the cement in the tri-state area and we'll let you keep on snoozing, Vic responded, hopeful. They want my blood. My bedding. My effluence. My waste. You know they will not stop drilling. You do not want them to. This is the most money you will make for any job. They unleash other primevals, and with the repeat business, you could eventually buy an army. No. That's not possible now. A sports team, he continued. I'm not the retiring type. If I stop keeping myself busy, I might as well find some accommodations and be like you. Just in a smaller pit of loneliness and filth, Vic responded. It's not all bad. But once loosed, I will return to my old ways. My prison is as part of my nature and being now. Once loosed from it, I will be what I once was. So you must succeed in your task, he said. Lot of pressure, I said. How can I trust you? What you're saying. I know ascetiumens aren't as manipulative as luxuriumens, but you guys are plenty convincing in your own way. Vic had mentioned the names of the two most seductive breeds of demons. No one was sure if the demons inspired these feelings or if they merely embodied the Platonic ideal of such concepts. Demons of lust were very alluring creatures, just ask any teenager. They had mostly human features. Beautiful, chiseled torsos. Hauntingly striking faces. Hairless bodies save for feathers or fur at their heads and the ends of their extremities, where they started to take on corvid or capron mien. Creatures of sloth had gained influence as technology enabled more sedentary existence for a percentage of mankind. They weren't obscenely fat. They were lumpy, soft things. The shape of the ideal of beauty in Renaissance artwork, now the average all around the world thanks to unhealthy food. They also were the embodiment of what were now called comfort zones. They were the most insidious and enticing demons because they offered crippling comfort, believe me or do not. Act or do not. Hell, join me or do not. Whatever happens, happens. You spent a lifetime keeping victory from the forces of evil. Eventually your fight will be at its end and something will take your place. And they will be worse at it than you. Because that would be preferable to knowing that they were better. There's the voice of the fallen angel I'm used to. Vic smiled and tried to slap him across the back, encouragingly, but he was gone. Vic awoke. He felt rested. He wasn't at the rest area. Not anymore. His car was in park on the side of the road and was warm. The big guy had gotten him back to El Valle. He was just outside the city limits, although calling the place a city was a loose description of the recently incorporated metro area that included the southernmost tip of Texas and America, as well as the 70 miles in either direction away from the Mexican border. There were several former towns in this area and still plenty of farmland and empty spaces. Hunton was only slightly larger in square miles, but had about 5 times the population and 1,000 times the wealth. You couldn't drive the remaining 3 hours of the trip up there and not get pulled over. This was not the first instance of lost time he'd experienced. It was the most convenient instance. Vic had made up the 3 hours he had yet to drive and he felt fresh. The sense of wrongness was no worse than what he was used to. The idea of losing control just bothered him to no end. The big guy couldn't have pulled off what he did if he wasn't operating within some bounds. If he wasn't telling the truth about their destinies. Vic got out of his car and looked around. No new dents, dings, or blood stains. It was a pretty straight shot, the road he had been on. Vic wasn't too worried about other drivers as much as he was worried he had have slammed into a deer or a tree or off a hill. Or into the rancho, nothing on the outside. Vic looked in. The seats, the dash, console, floor. They were all clean. He popped the trunk. There were the clothes he'd soiled during the first bits of the quest, as well as all the ones he'd had yet to launder the past few weeks. All of them smelled like laundry detergent and fresh linen fabric softener. His favorite smell. Well, for laundry, Vic's favorite would have to be hers. There was a note on the pile. Slick, leathery parchment, rolled up and stamped with the waxy seal of the big guy. It looked like simple drawing of a snail, with 2 humps instead of a shell, leaving a trail that became what seemed like mountains over it. Vic unrolled the note. The lettering singed onto it and read, "You are always in such a rush. This way you will be presentable for your date. And will not have to be in such a hurry. I did enjoyed our conversation. Do what you will. Send the half-blood my regards." This missive and our conversation consumed the bits of my essence you had gathered, but there will be plenty of opportunities to get all the demon shit you need in the immediate future. Sincerely, the big guy. Vic checked his phone. No more messages from her. The last one was his short response to her summons, OMW. The rest of his notifications were a few voicemails from Montez giving him a timeline of the working lunches and other such opportunities she'd have to slow the drilling. Denial had already set in, but the two of them had prepared for loopholes that their bosses would attempt to utilize on the supernatural, business, and bureaucratic ends. Vic was a professional when it came to getting paid. Had the professional life thing down as much as any adult who operates in a quasi-legal manner such as he could. As for his personal life, Chapter 22, going to California. Why would an actor date another actor? Why enter into any sort of arrangement with another narcissist in need of constant approval and validation? Maybe, as in nature, the combination of solitarily combustible or deadly elements, real elements not the traditional elemental forces, results in something essential. Like how sodium and chloride are, on their own, unstable but utterly essential to life as salt. Normies don't get it, and until we get into that world we never will. It's nice to not have to explain your time away or parse the kissing scenes with your jealous partner. The sex scenes aren't difficult for a civilian partner to get over, but a convincing kiss has ended marriages. Vic wasn't a celebrity. Unless his exploits got made into a movie or an HBO series, the only places that could authentically portray not just the violence, but the full-on sex. Of course, it would be whomever they got to play him that would get all the attention. That wouldn't be so bad. Vic's business didn't function well with anything besides infamy. An analogy can be made between the celebrinati and those of individuals on the front lines of the supernatural battle for the fate of mankind. Civilians just see all the glamour and misunderstand the multiple interpretations of the word interesting. Vic was hardly bored, but he didn't get much sleep. He was constantly harried by hanger-ons and was ultimately powerless in the face of those who truly run things. It's pretty easy to stay in your class. Other occult justice warriors accept the baggage for a time. Or they keep it casual. When you catch feelings, though, it's easy to get scared off. Not just because of commitment issues. You see a chance to leave it all behind. A chance at normal. You peek through the window and you see all your kids and your kids' toys cluttering the floor. Football on the television. The two of you fighting over who's going to empty the dishwasher. Who's not doing enough or making enough money. In Vic's dream, at least, this is where he looks down and sees that he's the one peeking into that life. He's the fiend that has to disrupt that scene of domestic desolation, peel off and discard the husks of Mr. and Mrs. Grown-Up Potter and feast on the sweet innocence they've knowingly brought into the world full of monsters he had stopped putting away. To really use magic, your soul has to be stained. You have to profane that creative spark to make it shine brighter, burn hotter. You have to be marked in a way that dictates you won't get normal, not that you'd be happy with just normal. People are born with this, anointed by fate. They might also earn it. They might seek it out. However it happens, when you become magical you are to some degree damaged goods. It's kind of like overclocking your computer. Its performance will increase but you'll burn out your system sooner than you would if you ran it under factory settings. Magical training is akin to those enhancements you would make to the cooling and the coating of your device, so that it puts off the end even longer. It's like throwing plastic shit and chemically treated wood on a fire. It's not healthy and only temporarily sustains. The greater powers, good and bad, can then recruit you and help you manage until you become too much of a liability. It's like going over a waterfall in a barrel on the river Styxx. Really, the only bad part is at the end. Who wants to go out like a jack-off with a bunch of shitty kids and a ballooning sack of shit spouse? How many of the Doctor's companions can go back to their own lives after having seen infinite space and time? She was Lila Ash. Went by the name of Suede sometimes. A descendant of Asmodeus, demon king of lust. Sounds scarier than it is. Historians claim that 10% of the population has Genghis Khan's DNA. Asmodeus had that beat, long before the Jesus era. Few from his line awakens their demon blood. And not every sex addict, predator, worker, and such has been tainted by him. He is legion, but there are a lot of sick fucks out there, a lot of victims and still plenty independent, open-minded people who don't deserve to be mentioned in the same sentence as those criminals because they contribute a lot more to everyone's happiness than your average mall Santa who only works a couple months out of the year. How does a demon reform? Leopards or Dalmatians don't lose their spots after all. That stupid frog or turtle that swims the scorpion or snake across the river has it coming. Everyone who's not in a stupid life lesson for someone else. No one's anything. We're all a little bit of everything. At different parts of our lives, to different people. You get stuck on a definition and it's your problem, not the person who's failing to meet your expectations. Lila was raised in a hippie commune 10 years after those things should have just disappeared, but deep South Texas gets everything after several years after it's cooled off. Gone stale. A nice mix of syncretized granola, feminine Satanism, the specter of which Jerry Falwell saw in every such group. Her moms and dads tried different pairings, midwives, and birthing rights to birth into the world the first female president. You might think otherwise, but it is necessary to qualify the misguided activities of idiots, and the vocal minority of progressives who may have more in common with Falwell and Robertson despite their own scorn of such folks. 1. You need to look in the mirror before you accuse anyone else of passive-aggressive intolerance. Projection isn't just when someone casts out their spirit form into the astral plane to get a free show and save money on airfare. There was nothing wrong with the South Texas hippie commune's motives. Well, besides trying to sell that origin story of the female Barack Obama nationwide. No, the problem happened with their process and lack of honesty with one another. On Padre Island, there's a nude beach that's been tantalizing school children. You can't take any of the roads there. You have to drive up the beach. With a vehicle that can bypass the beach access and not get stuck in the sand. And you have to believe it's there. Past that collection of old, naked, flabby, sunburnt skin, and sun-bleached bone, was the commune. First mistake. A beach is nice. Proximity to the womb that is the ocean is a good place to connect with the Earth Mother and have blessings on your child and awaken your parental instinct and spirit. Unless it's the beach that, for a solid 3 months out of the year, is an unrestrained bacchanal fuckfest. The lives of those who live there and aren't just visiting are complicated, ruined, the feelings that are hurt, and all the dissolution of marriages, relationships, and all that inevitable sexual violence means that the place is a feeding ground for monsters. Like when gulls have the all-you-can-eat buffet after spawning season, demons of all shapes and sizes feed on the human misery and excess. Those piddly shit little demons draw to them bigger ones. The big guy at the bottom of the ocean isn't due for a few more decades, but some of his lieutenants do stir on these occasions. This particular ceremony took place when a few children of Asmodeus and some not-so-old ones were prowling, looking for the sweatmeats that usually could be there on the beach. As the demon of lust, Asmodeus could spread his bloodline by inspiring or overseeing the act of copulation, but he rarely was so restrained or hands-off. Any cautionary tale about overindulging in fornication that made it into popular culture, literature, or common knowledge centered around the demon itself. It isn't too active now, not directly, but its descendants and followers are out there. Lesser fiends try and steal away these loyal devil worshippers. Or be threatened and offended by their presence in claimed territory. The ensuing turf war made for an even greater clusterfuck. The divine tried to damper their meddling with some nasty weather that year. An extra-long winter, which just kept people in the bars or in their hotel rooms. Demons are a cowardly lot. Most were subsumed by their betters and by the end of the revelry, a few bunkered down in their dens of iniquity. Several of them set up shop all year and so they were relatively stable. Others got evicted. One of the new ones isn't so bad. Has a nice independent brewery and pub. Good stuff, they bided their time. The commune was warded well enough to prevent any incursion, which brings us to the second mistake. Talk to your loved ones. Really talk. They have to love you no matter what they say, and if they don't, they're not worth it. Hell, if they cast you out, it's that much easier to stay away. Some people just don't fit together. Family has at least the blood in common, but sometimes that's not enough. You'd think that basic premise of pop psychology would have found its way into the hippie commune, what with live and let live being spouted in some variation since the 60s. But every one of those people were human, and humans do a good job of mucking things up. All it took was one, not necessarily jealous, monogamous individual who'd lied about being open to and okay with all the swinging to create that invocative invitation to a demon who would then needle his grubby little talon into an otherwise workable arrangement. And boom. You have demons possessing vessels and inflicting pain or pleasure and growing in power until everyone's dead or something bigger smacks them down. In this case, a few women were fertilized and those babies had the mark. The trauma of their upbringing coupled with that latent demon blood would guarantee new soldiers in the army of any number of Dukes of the Abyss, first come first serve. Lila and her twin brother were two of these beings. They made quite the gruesome twosome in their day, but she went straight. And she never said anything about her brother when her and Vic were dating. They were at a little diner a few blocks up from Lila's Herberia and Lectura shop downtown. During the day the place was full of local shopkeepers and international shoppers buying any number of gaudy, brightly colored wares, electronics, and novelties. A few low-level mystics had shops to sell them candles, incense, teas, or statues. In the evening, the place was a hub of nightlife. A rotating array of clubs and bars opened, closed, rebranded, and reopened to support the nightlife. It was a nice place for someone like Lila to stay straight, and occasionally indulge without anyone noticing. She could bring anyone back with her to her shop to sup. If she really liked you, she'd play hard to get though. At least that was what Vic told himself. It was her message that got to Vic while he was in the middle of the Pena investigation, and southwest the 3-hour drive home meant they were having an early dinner instead. Such was her hold over him. Vic answered her call. He would accept her forgiveness or give it, and they'd be back at it again for a few weeks. A couple of months. They've been at this for years now. She'd often been the missus in that dream with the house. But it was always just a dream Vic never wanted to wake up from. I'm going to California. San Diego. It's the close enough to what I'm familiar with, but far enough, she said after greeting Vic with a kiss on the cheek. She didn't beat around the bush with pleasantries like she normally did. Some friends of mine bought a house. I'm going to be their nanny until I get on my feet. Who's in California? What's in California? Vic asked. More than here. I've been falling into old habits more than is healthy. Maybe I can work with immigrants, eventually, she said, glancing at the basket of chips in front of them. Hasn't been me, and I guess I don't want to know much more than that, Vic said. You won't offer anything about what you've been up to, so don't tell me that, she answered, and Vic looked at the poster of The Sopranos on the wall. The place was going for a sort of classic Hollywood theme. And so they had a poster of The Sopranos, among others. You know, we have immigrants here, he quipped before waving his hands and dismissing the gesture. I appreciate you telling me you're leaving. I knew someday you would go, but I didn't think you'd give me the courtesy of making sure that candle was snuffed out before you left. I was wrong. About a lot of things. Don't start, Vic. You're going to make it hard for me, and it's already fucking terrible, she said, her eyes getting a little brighter. You could come with me. I know you want to be with me, I want to be with you. This place is poisoning everything that's good. Levi told me not to go back to LA last time I was there. Manny lets me poke around Vegas so long as I don't rock the boat. I'd bring down too much heat. You think it's tough to pick up the phone here, Vic said, immediately regretting the barb. I can't talk to you. How do you fall in love with someone who takes everything you say the wrong way? She asked, dismissing an offer of more coffee by the waitress. Not everyone would drop what they're doing and drive 3 hours to get, well, not broken up with, but whatever this is, Vic responded. No. But you know what they say about burning twice as bright, she added. Half as long. I'm glad you're leaving, he said. You're lying, she immediately cut in. In many ways, yes. I'm glad you're leaving like this. With a plan and a place to go. I hope things get better for you and you find what you're looking for. I just wish it was me. He said. I wish it could be you, too, she added and got up. Vic grabbed her by the forearm as she started to leave. He didn't need to squeeze or try and hold her. She stopped. Vic pulled her close and held her in his arms. In that moment everything was right in the world. They were the two parts of the yin and the yang. Two normal people with more love for each other than most people ever experience. Not just two fuck-ups, equally terrified of any kind of normalcy and the happiness or disappointment that might offer. She knew she had to get away from her triggers. Those people that kept her falling into the same trap. Kept ruining her. And so she was trying. He couldn't. If you asked any of Lila or Vic's friends, they'd say the two were bad for one another. But if any of them saw the two right now, then they'd hesitate and not immediately dismiss the two as hostages to the other's idiosyncrasies. Or mania. Or paranoia. Vic didn't want to let go. But he had to. He didn't want to feel her start to. Chapter 23. Down in an old West Texas town, Vic had legwork to do in Peña. Unlike in Piedras Blancas, there was no connection to the outside world, criminal or otherwise. It wasn't lorded over by an upwardly mobile gay couple trying to break into a hostile workplace. It wasn't an odd couple of shark and dolphin floating around a school of fish, picking them off one by one. It was a hive. An infestation. A war zone. The demons would style themselves after the princes and dukes of the underworld and wage war on one another until one reigned supreme and the others were consumed, suborned, or sent back to hell. This was Vic's only chance to disrupt what had been set in course by the loosening of the big guy's bonds. Their conflict was inconvenient but necessary. Similar to the gestation of sharks, who are born live, in their mama's belly. They don't have any other food except their brothers and sisters. The one that makes it out is the strongest. The best and the worst. A similar principle explains why there were folks like Vic Fender fighting the good fight. He wasn't seeking out real estate in heaven for his efforts. So far as Vic was concerned, the afterlife was a return to some void at worst and a sacrifice of your own personality and individuality at best. He was good, deep down inside. That part of him demanded that he fend off these sorts of monsters so that those who could not were able to live the life he was denied. He was sure that he was correct and that his foes were inhuman. The spawned demons were the scales, fingernails, and leavings of the slumbering beast. The parasites and symbiotes. The cage was a torture chamber for the sentient fiends and imps, and a society emerged when it was cracked open. Those who fell victim to the greater predator were better suited to torment and terrorize the unsuspecting public in the next town over, Peña. If a useful idiot was identified among the populace, they would be groomed for servitude. The righteous defenders who rose to the occasion and tried to save their city might have been up to the challenge and could have fought off the monsters if their conviction was strong and their faith was true. Lacking training or preparedness, maybe even humanity, their likely fate wouldn't be that of a hero. If some zealotry or pride was at the root of their being, if they were a little more pickled than pure, their strength of will would only single them out as a suitable host for possession. By one of the would-be lieutenants or maybe the big guy himself. Even with his training and experience, fighting demons always carried with it the threat of possession. They speak to one's fears and insecurities. They offer power, pleasure, and the ability to rail off a killer lick. But if you're too sure of yourself, they don't make you question whether or not you'll fail. They take away your ability to doubt. Mankind is a sorry patchwork always gnawed at by silverfish. The alternative, being stuck in the closet smelling of mothballs, isn't a worthwhile existence either. For what it's worth, Vic had participated in the occasional fiddle contest, but the stakes were usually pretty low. Small potatoes. That was another story. He rented a used Jeep and pulled into town. Montez had wanted to come along, but Vic told her that her part of the ride was over. She'd slow him down and he had to act fast. He couldn't do a door-to-door, so he had to find the would-be right and left hands of the big guy and shut down their operation. Peña looked beat up. Like a hurricane blew through after a hailstorm. The layers of dirt and jungle of weeds told Vic that it wasn't the demons that ruined the town. Peña was one of those places that had been forgotten. Its inhabitants were anyone who could barely get by on the little bit of government assistance and their children, whose failure in and by the public education system would keep them close to the rotten apple tree. But don't try and tell them. Pride and self-esteem was as high as ever in this little burg. Vic had Montez's spare set of keys. If the thief was from here, or if they were on the big guy's side, they'd be here. A tracking spell would make the enchanted keys shudder and glow the closer he got, or should have. Vic couldn't tell if it was getting a signal or if he just had some nagging aches and pains. Tracking it down would be problematic. He didn't have to. Montez's truck was parked at the one gas station in town. There used to be two. A Calexo did a good job of putting the Ma and Pa gas station on the ropes. Now the chain store was shuttered. Boards on the window and no signs of life. Across the street, there was signs of traffic coming into and leaving it. Peña was a town you only found if you were looking for it, or if you got lost. No one came here unless they had tried to escape, and failed, or had no other choice. Appearances had to be maintained, no matter how thin. During the day, the mortal agents and worshippers kept watch. If someone was passing by, they'd see them on their way. The right amount of intolerance or befuddlement would make someone keep driving. If these travelers needed gas, then they couldn't get away. It was easy enough to identify those truly lost souls among them, and come from behind with a tire iron. The big guy's agents would watch one another as they terrorized the cowed populace. Whoever rocked the boat or looked like they'd fight back would be locked down until the evening, when Daddy got home. And then it was a public spectacle in the center of town. It was kind of like the witch hunts of old, because demons don't get many human things, but they do appreciate irony. Vic parked at the pump and acted like he was going to fill up. The card reader was working, but Vic inserted his cred stick the wrong way to ensure it wouldn't function. There wasn't a visible security camera, but he still kept the black bar, hologram, and shiny numbers hidden. It wasn't hard. He knew a few card tricks and some sleight of hand. No one came to help. Vic feigned some frustration. Vulnerability. He was wearing some coveralls from another area oil company. A fresh pair with his name, Vic, on the tag. They were baggy, and that allowed him to conceal on his person a number of items which would help achieve his purpose. His same dirty work boots. Some fingerless work gloves. A cowboy's cap. Vic didn't look local, but he didn't look out of place. Vic didn't get out of his comfort zone, so he strove not to force anyone out of theirs. One of the secrets of infiltration. He moved to the glass storefront and opened the door. The shelves were empty save for a few useless or distasteful items. The clearance section with candy and snacks that were already expired when their price was reduced and other stuff that never sold. Gaudy shirts, hats, and decorations. Most of the faithful sundries had been broken or defaced. Statues of Mary and crucifixes were broken in half or decapitated. Anything that could be picked up or used as a commodity had been taken off the shelves and likely hoarded by the survivors. There were some auto supplies still stocked. Small electrical components, fuses, bulbs, and radio parts that only truckers could use. Several different kinds of tire pressure gauges. A few cones. Windshield wiper fluid and coolant. No oil. No paper or household products, but a few cleaning supplies. No cans or bags of anything except some cat litter and pet food. All the tobacco was still stocked, but the boxes were dull and looked slightly distressed. Empty, to maintain some sense of normalcy. The lights were on but no one was behind the register. It still felt like Vic was being watched. He walked up to the counter and rang the bell, and rang, then knocked on the counter. A short, skinny, dark-skinned man came from out back. He was wearing jeans and a larger, stained white shirt, and flip-flops. "What do you need?" "How can I help you be of service?" he asked. "Needed some gas. My card wasn't working." "I don't have any cash, so I need 20 on one," Vic answered and avoided his gaze. He fumbled the cell phone in his hand and did his best to look like he wasn't looking or listening at all the inconsistencies and incongruencies. "Yeah. If they're down out there, these won't work. I'm not a regular here. I'm temporary so I don't know if I can help," he said, putting his hands in the air and shrugging. "If you can make it 30 miles north, you probably can try there." The Calexo looked closed. "First I've ever seen them shut one down," Vic said. "Yeah. They're all over the place but yeah, you won't be able to get anything there," he said. "That your truck out there?" Vic asked casually. Yeah. Well, I used it to get here," he answered. "A friend of mine has one just like it. I like trucks, I just prefer a smaller one. It's just me so I don't need to be hauling a bunch of crap," Vic said, not looking up from his phone. The men thought Vic didn't notice his change in posture. The sweat on his forehead. Tightening of his stance. A smaller truck means you still have to help your loser friends move, but it's only out of apartments and stuff. He didn't realize Vic knew he was about to spring, so Vic robbed him of the element of surprise with the press of a button. Bleep. Bleep. Bloop. The truck's noises repeated several times, trying to alert authorities that were long dead and gone. It gave Vic enough time to grab the man's arm and flip him onto the ground. There was the crash of the plastic cases of lottery tickets hitting the ground and spilling all of the town's hopes and dreams onto the floor. Then a dull thud of the man's back and a slap of his hands against the floor. Vic kept a knee and most of his weight on the man's sternum and held the arm between his elbow and against his body. Now you're not making things look good for you. Not just because of the sandals with socks. You don't want to fight in sandals. What if this shit gets on YouTube, son? Vic said. Vic was only allowed to go on because the men kept resisting, but Vic just needed a slight bit of pressure to keep him down. If he'd have been ridden by a demon, he would have nonplussed by the discomfort. Plenty of them have come at Vic using a compound fracture as a crude stabbing implement. Vic didn't hurt him yet, rather he responded with any movement with the right amount of pressure to keep him immobile. He eventually stopped resisting and gratefully sucked in the air as Vic allowed him more room to breathe when he stopped fighting. What do you want from me, man? You can have the truck back. I was just borrowing it, I needed to get out of there. You were there, you saw what was there. He said, his words punctuated with deep, panicked breaths. If he spoke too many useless words and phrases, Vic would apply some pressure, cut him off. Not to be cruel, not for fun. Vic didn't want to let on like he knew too much. See what cards the men would play before he revealed his own. I got Pryor's men, have it back. I'll pay for the gas. Those things just killed everyone. No one could do anything. I had to hide in the rancho, he went on. Vic eased up when the men made with some details and a sort of positive reinforcement. I'm going to get some holy water from my pocket. If that sort of thing is going to fuck your day up, by all means try and stop me. But that'll be the hard way. The easy way is letting me do my thing, and maybe we both get to walk away from this, whatever you are, Vic said. Vic wasn't sure how much he was lying. He meant most of it. The men didn't resist, and when Vic eased up, offering him some opportunity to escape, he didn't take it. A few sprinkles didn't do anything to him. Vic got some zip ties out and bound his arms behind his back. Get up. We're gonna talk. Then you're going to return the truck, if you make me happy, Vic said, and he tested the bounds and then started to resign himself to an execution-style gangland slaying. Sit. Vic patted the countertop. You see any of the townsfolk? There was the clerk. He was making noise, so I popped him. He went down, but smacked his head. I think the counter. He didn't wake up. He's in the beer freezer, he said. Again he had the look of someone who was incriminating themselves. Was he one of them? Vic asked. What? Like an Apu? He responded. No. Like back at the rig, Vic said. Some of the life returned to him. The question was some validation that he wasn't crazy. Not at first, man. He treated me like I was gonna steal something, but there weren't nothing to steal. Acted like he was gonna call the cops. He pulled out a shotgun. So I hit him with the sunglass rack, he said. It was dented and there weren't very many pairs that hadn't been damaged. But that was usually par for those displays. How long ago was this? Vic asked. I got here yesterday. I have a DUI, so I don't got a license. Get a ride with my coworker to the rig, and I live an hour away, so I didn't remember how to get here right away. I got lost and almost was out of gas before I found the right road, he said. She had GPS in her truck, Vic said. Shit was locked. Couldn't figure out the code, he responded. Your story checks out. Come with me, we're gonna check on your prisoner. If he's dead, I'll help you hide the body, Vic said. He was scared at first but relieved when Vic offered assistance. If he's not dead, well, you're going to have to help me. Help you what? He asked, starting to get scared. We'll get there, let's hope you got him good. Vic said. The bloodstains weren't apparent at first, they'd been cleaned up haphazardly given the lack of supplies, but some hard-to-reach places or crevices did have blood dried in them. The door to the freezer didn't close right. Most of the refrigeration was contained, but some moisture did pool around the cracks. You couldn't see into it through the glass door, covered in advertisements as it was. Shinnerfest looked good this year. Vic hoped he could make it this year. He hoped he'd make it out of all of this alive. Open it, Vic said. He shrugged and showed Vic his bound hands. Use your shoulders or something. You think people who lost both arms in the war don't become alcoholics? They just have to want it. The men fidgeted and got it open. Vic held it open and waved him inside. He made to protest, but Vic kicked him in. He remained standing, his slick sandals weren't on his feet anymore. Nothing. No body. No pool of blood. No craft brews, just the lowest of the bottom shelf of beers. Vic picked one up that he hadn't realized they still brewed and cracked it open. He offered the other man a sip, but it wasn't accepted. Well, shit. And you didn't see him escape? Vic asked. He was here, man. He insisted. Then he probably made it back to the hive and they're going to zerg us, Vic said. Zerg? Zerg. Swarm. You don't know about the classics? Vic asked, and the men looked at him like he was speaking a different language. Kids these days. I don't expect you to stay and fight. I mean, you took a demon-possessed man out with a sunglass rack. That means you're not worthless, but this sort of thing is beyond your pay grade. What are you talking about, man? You work for the company? He asked, no less confused. Independent contractor. Kind of like you, but more of a specialist, Vic responded, took out a disposable e-cigarette, and took a swig of the swill. At least it was cold. You survived the first night, I'm going to let you survive this one. Take the truck and just go south. Don't stop going south. Some cops or border patrol should get you when you run out of gas. Just look like you're trying to sneak into the country when you start hearing cars. Vic said, what about you? He asked, I'm gonna stop this thing. Else I don't get paid. Vic answered, how do you know you can? They killed the entire oil rig of roughnecks. Killed and ate or got in their heads, he said. You don't look that hard. As a rock, Vic said, they took over the town. How do you clean up a whole town, man? They have the school and the police station and the courthouse. Those places are tough to clean up when they're full of assholes, let alone demons, he said. Vic didn't answer, just opened the fridge door and led him out to the front of the store. Come on, champ. Outside. I need to draw salt circles and shit, Vic said. You're a dead man, man. Good luck with your Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, he said, and headed towards the truck. You forgot the keys, Vic said. The other man paused mid-step. Oh yeah. Let me get them. He said and started to approach. Think fast, Vic said, and he reflexively turned away from the projectile. Except instead of assuming a standing fetal position like someone who had been picked last for T-ball, he caught them in his hand. All re. He started to say, but the keys glowed bright white and began to singe his palm. It smelled more like burnt hair than it did roasting barbecue. The men dropped the keys. He let out a familiar screech that wasn't even less masculine or mature. It was outright inhuman. His other hand grabbed the wrist of his wounded one and he started to blow on the burn. The small prayer beads and copper cross were smoking and glowing. Chapter 24. They finally found me. The jig was up. The demon-possessed clerk broke the zip ties that had restrained him and ran at Vic. Vic stepped to his side and grabbed him by one of his wrists. Demons are very aggressive, but unless they're seasoned and burnt out a lot of bodies, they're awkward in a human shell. They aren't used to the new form, or they're young and barely learning to walk. The demon was clever, but its primary function was to inspire fear in its foes. And revulsion. Vic wasn't a badass by any stretch, most of his courage is liquid or pharmaceutical, but he was used to the taint of evil. Vic smacked the demon's forehead and blew vapor onto his face. His opponent's perspiration kept the prayer paper attached and Vic's breath activated the sigil. He screamed in pain and struggled to break Vic's grasp. By the time he'd manifested his claws, Vic threw him on the ground. While he wiggled on the floor in pain, Vic poured salt on the ground in the form of a circle about 3 feet in diameter. The invisible barrier that formed allowed him to lean against it, but the demon couldn't escape. The gas pumps were covered by an awning, but some of the salt was not covered by the shadow, and so if it rained, Vic would have to put him down for good. He had to act quickly. Same rule applies, Haas. We both get to walk out of here if you play nice. Vic said. You're a child peeking under his bed. But here there are monsters, the demon responded. The power of Christ compels you, Vic said after he unzipped his fly and baptized his opponent. You are a fool and an amateur. It yelled and tested the boundaries of the ward, hoping Vic's stream disrupted the salt. To his chagrin, he was still bound. Take off the paper if you want to be free. But I wouldn't if I were you, Vic advised. The demon complied and started to peel it off, but the incantation had meant it magically adhered to his skin. It was like peeling off a scab. Vic's sigils remained as wounds. He was manic after that, screaming and crazed. "Go on and come at me, bro," Vic said. He slammed against the invisible barrier, and when he finally shattered the ward, there was a burst of energy and he was free. He turned to face Vic and jumped, his mouth extending into a fanged maw. His fingernails were claws the length of the pointy part of a fork. Time slowed. Vic tossed something like a dream catcher or God's eye into the air. Not solid like the latter, not single-stranded like the former. He stepped aside again and the demon missed him. The invading spirit was drawn into the floating magical trap and the body collapsed on the ground under it. It stayed suspended in air. The demon didn't have a body. It was more like a glob of an oily substance or a solid bit of shadow. It had a center of mass that was shaped like something of a body, but it didn't have arms or legs. Instead, 4 lines of the substance dripped from the rest of it. Occasionally these pieces would rise like they were controlled with an invisible string. Vic made a swatting motion with his open palm towards the ground and the demon dropped into its host. Rather than re-enter the host, it splashed onto his skin. The body was broken and now the invading spirit was utterly defeated. So what am I dealing with here? You already said something about the police station, the school, and the courthouse. What kind of swarms we got? Vic asked. The demon writhed painfully. The wounds the men had suffered were no longer concealed by the supernatural veil of the demon. There were deep cuts, bruises, jutting bits of bone and other types of protrusions. Swelling and redness where the broken bones almost pierced the flesh. These newly minted joints were frequently used for unnatural movement, giving the impression that they could poke out at any moment. The man would brace himself and try to rise, but to no avail. He couldn't overcome the diminished mobility that came with mangling the body's natural structure. Demon possession burns out its host, but these wounds were easy enough to conceal. Especially if the invader needed to manipulate others. Vic wasn't a doctor. Vic didn't know if the demon's host would make it or not. The demon could keep its host alive, somewhat. Vic placed the charm on his chest. He floated off the ground, his torso elevated and the rest of his limbs hung limp. His eyes opened and glowed with green light. "More than you are capable of handling, Vicente," he said in the squeaky demon voice. Creepy. Not as terrifying as the booming, deep one. It was telling of his age and power. Or lack of thereof. "You let me handle that. Deal still stands. I'm gonna stop the big guy from waking up. Whether you get the chance to rebuild after that, is up to you," Vic said as he poured some salt around the body. "How can I trust you?" he asked. "You've been at this a while. I smell the corruption. The holes in your being. You've been close to death. Close to the descent. You toss away parts of yourself just as easily as you toss aside friends, allies, and associates. You're sharp. Perceptive. You can decide if you want to die, or serve me, or try to serve them, after they think you're serving me," Vic offered. He took out a straight razor and started carving sigils onto the body. They looked like H's with lines emerging from the bottom serifs at 90-degree angles, with more perpendicular lines jutting from those. "You'll feel some power and autonomy as I apply these sigils. They're binding you, but also sustaining your presence here on the material world. I can finish it and you can be free to act as you like, so long as you remain loyal. I will not be your servant for the remainder of your life, no matter how short that is," he said. "No. Of course not. You can always sacrifice the body. That will end the terms of our service. Provided you have enough strength, you might be able to maintain a presence here. Or fend off other hungry demons. What do I have to do?" he asked. "Tell me about the lords. How many servants? Mortal followers? And the big guy's name?" Vic said, "I don't know it. When I rest I see it. It's glorious." "Your language is not adequate for its splendor," he said. "Nothing's ever easy, is it?" "I could disembowel you and read the portents of your guts," Vic said. "I won't get everything I need. And it would keep you from working for me. I could use the help. It's up to you. Tell me about the others. In the police department, it's not one, but a swarm. Insectoid imps. They act in unison. You'll have to clear them out. Just one will let them regrow. They can infect a human and when its eggs hatch, they eat their way out," he said. "That'll be fun. Not unmanageable. But it can get bad fast. The others. Vic asked. Sarcasm and understatement would have tipped off something that was closer to or more familiar with humanity than his captive. Vic tried to keep acting like he'd let nothing slip, but he wasn't sure how successful he was. He squeezed his hands into fists. The courthouse is ruled by a chaos lord. He is arbitrarily punishing the townsfolk. They are either serving him or locked up. They have implored him to help take over the school, where many of their children are being held by the worst kind of demon, an agent of terror. So far the wounds inflicted on them are psychological. But that won't occupy his time for very much longer. The judge, as he's known, won't act unless he has complete dominion over the people of the town. He's a week or two away from his goals. There are some holdouts. But if torture doesn't do the trick, watching your family inflict innumerable agonies and sins on one another usually will. Well, that's quite useful. Vic carved more of the sigils onto the demon's skin. They glowed red, and once the spell was complete they disappeared. Vic pocketed the trap. You may leave the town. Don't leave the country or the state. You don't have proper documentation, and I'm not going to pass you across a checkpoint. When I need you I'll summon you. Am I supposed to walk? It asked. Yes, Vic muttered angrily and ripped off its already torn shirt and sweatpants. It transformed into a more bestial, quadrupedal form and ran north. Vic was 60/40 that it would work out for the best. This one was something you'd want to keep close. Maybe show it another way than just exploiting humans and serving as a pawn in the great war between good and evil, with the infinitesimally small chance that someone would promote him. 3 demons barons. Vic hadn't dealt with a swarm lord before. He had worked as an exterminator. It was a good background in this line of work. His magical training involved several such extracurricular activities. He had worked with animals. With healthcare professionals, the Chaos Lord would be more tedious than actual work. You didn't want to seem too interesting to one of those. They wouldn't abandon their frivolous activities, not just for anybody. But they'll come around later, poking into your business. Which would only be worth it if she was a looker. The terror wouldn't have been so much of a problem were it not for the children. Vic would have to watch his language. That rubs off on kids, especially when they're trying to emulate the badass demon hunter who freed them and their town. The demon's lasting influence and tricks wouldn't be that much worse than a bad drug trip, mainly just inconvenient. Except for having to save all the children. Some of them were probably having a field day. There's always at least one Carl Grimes. Chapter 25. Flight of the Bumblebee. It was late in the day, but Vic still had some light left. As loath as he was to stick around and keep watch over the town at night, he had no other choice. The dark would let out the worst monsters but also keep him relatively hidden, so long as Vic didn't try to sparkle. Vic scaled the town's water tower so that he had a vantage point over Peña's surroundings. Vic took a hunting rifle with him. There was no need to use magic for scrying or defense when a little physical activity and an exercising of his Second Amendment rights would do the trick all the same. The town was a lot closer to the edge than Vic had expected, even with his earlier experiences at the nearby oil rig and the gas station. It was a smaller town, with a smaller population. Even bolstered by the Roughnecks, there was barely a couple hundred. The census had included many who lived on the outskirts in ranches and family homes, but that couldn't increase the number to beyond 1,000 at best. No one was moving through town during the day. Vic walked to his destination veiled but didn't need to be. He didn't feel any effort to pierce his magical cover. Vic had bolstered the spell by drawing on some of his newly acquired familiar's power. This added a camouflaging element to the spell, but in place this far gone to shit even a magical veil could stick out the way someone in camo in the city or with a beard online at the airport does. The vigilant in these situations are looking for any sparkle or bit of magic which will stand out and give a hint of a challenge. Vic could see the 3 dens. He didn't need to peek into any other realm to recognize the level of corruption contained within. The weather was still cloudy and gray, but these parts felt especially miserable. It wasn't a fog or miasma that surrounded them. It was more like the fumes at the gas pump, with a dark, tinging effect on your view of them. The whole town looked like a war zone, but rather than exploded munitions, it looked as though bodies had combusted. There were chunks all over the place. A swarm lord is bad news whether or not they become corrupt. They start out the consumers of spiritual detritus. The spirit realm is not an ecosystem entirely in line with the laws of balance and homeostasis of the earthly realm, but it's close enough. Each of the innumerable realms has its own version of such creatures, suited to those disparate environments. In the rougher places these carrion develop an almost mindless, hive mentality, but there are plenty of individual foragers. Like other demons, they become corrupt through the meddling of humans or by eating something that warps their original purpose. They can be unleashed in this realm without being so twisted, and in their mindless drive to feed they'll eat anything. The most common instance of their emergence entails an incomplete translation of a summoning ritual that can unleash them on a group of innocents in a misguided attempt at black metal, high school evil. Some of the work had already been done for Vic. The police department, while good for a second redux of assault on Precinct 13, was not a suitable stronghold for demons. It was a small, two-story building that was once a dingy white, back when it hadn't been covered in profane graffiti. It had been sealed off by either the few remaining townsfolk or the servants of the other demons to keep the vermin contained. Each entrance had cars stacked in front of them. The carport was sealed off with both confiscated vehicles and police cars. A smaller garage remained accessible, and there was sign of foot traffic. The most apparent of which was the trail of gore and viscera. There wasn't one trail of blood and bits of effluence and bone. Too many bodies had been dragged about the place, and so there was a thick, if textured streak. Some bodies were hanging off the roof in a state of early decay. The smell was a wall of spoilt meat and shit that cordoned off the swarm's territory. Someone was feeding them. The insects were making use of every bit and left nothing for the vultures and other scavengers that were suspiciously absent from a place filled with death. Providing the swarm with steady supply of the corpses of work animals and humans so it wouldn't hunt. One of the other demons could be doing this, but it would be a use of resources and a distraction that might let the other cognizant baron gain the upper hand. If they could pull it off, though, gaining control of the swarm would be a considerable advantage for one of the barons. Whatever was left of it, the swarm would likely be a tool that the big guy would want to use when he awoke. And whoever was responsible for its destruction would most definitely draw his ire. Not too late into dusk, a cargo truck pulled into the carport and dumped dozens of garbage bags. A dark, dirty liquid dripped out of some of them and the cab of the truck. The driver was a short, slightly overweight man. He had a blue trucker cap and a red vest. Underneath was a red plaid shirt and he wore jeans and work boots. Trucker Satanists are just the worst. Grown-up metalheads who decide their life needs a different direction. And it's not go to night school or take online classes. They don't try online dating instead of truck stop hookers. It's an attempt to try and recapture the lost nostalgia of their youth when they were in their band Sabotage and had all those stoned conversations around the Ouija board. Vic looked through his scope at the truck. There was someone else with the trucker. A woman in the passenger side of the vehicle. A bit frumpy, but probably better than he was used to. Not a complete devolution thanks to the drugs, but certainly closer to the after than the before of a Faces of Meth poster. She had several ear and face piercings. The trucker took out a small moleskin notebook and seemed like he was reading something while he waved his other hand in the air. From his mouth, ears, and sleeves emerged a few flies, which quickly became a swarm. They entered into the cracks of the building, and when he finished he keeled over spent, barely able to prevent himself from falling to the ground. His girlfriend or woman left the truck and went by his side. He tried to wave her off, but she insisted on helping him up. She was wearing short cutoffs and a t-shirt that was given at a fair or some kind of event from 2006, which was the only screen-printed words still clear and readable despite its age. One of the garage doors rolled up and some roach/crab-looking beasts the size of medium to large dogs crawled out. They walked on all of their legs, but when they grabbed some of the bags, they held it over them and their pace didn't slow. They hurried to the couple, but stopped short of tackling them when they got close enough. Vic heightened his senses and reached out to hear them. "How much longer?" she asked with a surprising accent. "Won't be too long." "They're getting big," he answered with a less surprising one. "They growed up fast. The town did a good job beating them back into the station, and that left them vulnerable to the other barons. When that happened they had to regrow the swarm. We just gotta wait for the other two to settle their tea kettles and then we can send the bugs out again to clean up. When we bring our swarm to the Lord, he'll reward us." "You sure? Why do we have to kneel down?" she asked. "Something big is gonna happen when he wakes up. He'll need servants and he'll need cattle and he'll need generals. He's like us, baby girl. He doesn't want to be stuck in this shit town for his whole life. He's got bigger plans," he answered. "And then he'll help you take over your trucking company so you can help him get where he wants to go." She asked, "Yeah. But not just that. That's just the beginning. We'll be able to go wherever we want then. Spread the word of our Lord and the health of the swarm. When he takes over this world, we'll have a nice place at the top, he said. She reached for his crotch and kissed him. One of the smaller bugs approached and looked at them puzzled. He kicked it aside and pulled her into the truck. He tossed her shirt out of the window and dropped his pants around his ankles. They started going at it. She was propped up on the seat, with the door open. For God and everyone to see. She asked him to get into the truck so that they wouldn't be interrupted by their pets, and he obliged, closing the door. The bugs retreated with their meals into the police station and the garage closed shortly afterwards. The big truck started rocking. They had to be going at it pretty good. Vic would have anywhere between 30 seconds and 5 minutes. Not being Batman, Vic couldn't zip line down to them. That would have provided the most stealth, and certainly been the most badass. Vic could have posted it on YouTube and get a lot more business. 1 out of every 100,000 of the cool videos online are someone who's discovered or discovering their innate magical ability, which is manifesting as the luck or increased athletic ability needed to pull off the impossible. If undiscovered, it could lead to a career as a professional athlete, but the sanctity of such competition is shielded against magical cheating. This goes back to the Aztecs' flower wars, the Olympics, and the Roman games. Just like an amphitheater or coliseum sends sound out to the audience, it focuses their energy into a kind of dome over the contestants. It's more magic than an untrained magician is capable of dealing with. And those who are trained are told about the rules against such cheating. The internet has led to a general relaxation of things. Video proof of everything is on there now, but enough disbelief exists to keep people doubting. Vic didn't quite shapeshift into a literal beast. Rather, he took on the aspect of a gliding animal. It's the same spell in any locale, but the animal you appear as depends on what is around. If he had been closer to Austin, he might have seemed bat-like. This far south, it was the noble turkey vulture. It was better than one of his first transformations. He had spent the night prior to that lesson on a date at an art house cinema. When it was time to practice shape-shifting, he couldn't turn into anything besides a flamingo. Vic's only hope was that no one was paying attention. The swarm was likely contented with the delivery. He wouldn't be drifting down towards the other dens, so they wouldn't notice. And the couple was in flagrante delicto. Vic felt bad about ambushing them during their most vulnerable and intimate moment. Vic landed by one of the barricading vehicles, and when he hit the ground he heard the car start up. That didn't take long. Vic found cover and saw the truck start to drive off. Malahosushio. He held out his hand as he uttered a bad luck curse. Something strong enough to cause all but the newest cars driving off the lot to stall, pop a tire, or go dead. The trucker didn't look like he owned the rig, or bought anything new. Women included. Otherwise, he wouldn't have needed the demon to fulfill the lofty ambition of taking over his tucking company. The truck slowed and then stopped moving. He hurriedly rushed out of the vehicle, visibly worried over being out in the open this late. He popped the hood and started looking over each part that might be smoking, leaking, or on the brink of explosion. His girlfriend came out and tried to help, but he was short with her and demanded she get back in the truck. They started fighting, and hopefully that would be enough distraction. 2 shots at 2 centers of mass. Vic hit her first, in between her shoulder blades and around her right kidney, but the trucker wasn't so easy. He sensed the threat and somehow managed to place her in front of him, so she took the bullet meant for him. Anything comical about his get-up or the stereotypes Vic thought of were dispensed the moment he responded to the attack. Vic took one more shot and hit the trucker's shoulder, but it hardly fazed his target. All it had done was allow the trucker to locate his attacker. From the wound those same bugs poured out instead of blood. They flew down and swarmed the corpse of his girlfriend and disappeared. He then started towards Vic, spitting a different manner of swarm at the wizard. Whereas the previous encountered insects were closer to flies, these were green wasps. They flew at Vic, fast. He let the rifle fall to his side and summoned a shield. The first torrent splattered against it, bugs on a windshield. The rest stopped short and tried to sting. Vic could see the sick, green venom splash onto the magical energy that was protecting him. It wasn't much effort to remain unharmed. The trucker exhausted considerable reserves of those animating bugs in the process. He started to recall some of the swarm, and the pained expression on his face told Vic that he was getting desperate. Vic took a deep breath and exhaled flame, a large burst of fire that consumed some of them. Or rather, he summoned a small heart of flame in front of him and his breath spread it further. Fear creeped over the trucker's face. Vic would have laughed, but his mouth was full. So he raised his arms as he spewed the cleansing flame in victory. Vic hadn't seen the girlfriend, reanimated by the trucker's dark magic, skulk towards him. She didn't walk so much as float. It was as though the bugs had simply started to carry her towards Vic. She got too close and exploded in a shower of effluence and vermin. It knocked Vic back and he was stunned. The concussion activated a charm he had. His personal shield would hold, but another one of those blasts could easily end things. Vic couldn't see what was happening. There was a cry of frustration after he felt what were kicks to his body. A splash of some liquid onto Vic strained the shield's energies. Then he was being dragged. So far as he could tell, there was no permanent damage. Vic wasn't out for long. He guessed it was the poison that rendered Vic unconscious and not dead. The trucker could have regurgitated onto Vic like a fly would its food. He was dragged Vic inside the prison. Vic did his best to preserve the illusion of unconsciousness. The shield wouldn't protect his head as it knocked against the ground, so it wasn't exactly nap time on a pedicab. The foyer of the police station had been cleared out. The chairs and desks were stacked to serve as the base of the hive's construction. A silky weave was strewn all around. The roach crabs were not able to navigate the colony at all, rather they handed off the bags to creatures that resembled spiders with an anthropomorphic torso. These den mothers tended to the grubs and laid eggs in some of the bodies. The last quarter of the corpses was given to the young larval demons for sustenance. The trucker started to look emaciated. His wounds and burns had been patched up, but the small bugs that writhed in his body consumed him quickly from the inside even as they closed his wounds. His eyes sunk into his head and his skin was pulled tightly over his skeleton. I need more of the swarms, honey. This one has tried to destroy us and I would not let him. Provide for me like I have for you, he said, kneeling and holding out his arms in supplication. One of the spider women came down from her clutch and approached him. Each movement of its legs were deliberate, in contrast to the torso and arms that twitched like a regular arachnid. Vic quietly drew a sigil on his skin with some of the foul gunk on the floor and seemed dead to all but the most keenly sighted creatures. She prodded at Vic with one of her legs and seemed satisfied with the trucker's work. She seized the trucker with her front limbs violently, but held him close and tenderly with her humanoid arms. He grasped at her like someone who hadn't just lost his girlfriend or hadn't had sex a few minutes ago and seemed more or less ready for what came next. The spider woman retched and vomited an oily, bloody substance into his mouth. The sound was between someone gagging and clearing their throat of mucus. It wasn't quite solid or liquid and took considerable effort to expunge. The smell of burnt oil filled the room, stung the back of his nostrils, even though Vic was upwind. It spilled out of the trucker's mouth and washed over him as he could not drink it all. She dropped him to the floor and he gurgled and writhed. His previous bulk started to return. Vic took his shot. He wouldn't get another. Vic pulled out his wand from his sleeve and summoned a magic blade. Several forms of magic can harness mana to create a weapon. Whether or not you can keep it for longer than a few minutes, or if it will be of much use if you can't fight, are different spells altogether. Vic didn't need more than a sharp, long blade. No matter how they do it, the type of weapon summoned is up to the imagination of the magician. Many summon katanas or medieval swords. Vic had seen several regional shamans use macahuatls, Aztec swords that were like paddles. Except for the bits of mapped obsidian or shark teeth for blades. He preferred to summon a large slice of obsidian that was only coincidentally a sword, usually black unless Vic was pulling the energy from somewhere other than the standard infernal source when he was on a job. Ambient, demonic energy twisted to fight evil. Vic swung hard and the trucker's head didn't leave his body. But Vic had mangled the spine well enough to end the threat the trucker posed. Vic moved quick enough so that the swarm didn't notice at first. As soon as the trucker fell to the ground, they saw all and immediately reacted to the existential threat the wizard now posed. Vic dispelled the blade and cast another spell that would either speed the him up or slow time. It really depended on your stance on precisely what time is. The trucker either had an artifact, a parasite, or a tattoo that gave him some link to the swarm. If Vic couldn't find it, he'd have to finish decapitating his enemy and use the head as the material link to try and assert dominance over the swarm. That would be messy, and just awful. Vic started to feel the effects of so much magic use in such a short period of time. Coupling magical effects always compounds the cost. He had to use heightened magical perception to find the link while he was increasing his speed. Vic sensed it. Not either or. Both. A tattoo on the trucker's back of some kind of centipede-like demon, which was the projection of an actual spirit of such a creature underneath, inside the trucker's body. The bug was what best could be described as the central nervous system of the swarm. It was using its host's higher functions to coordinate the others, like a piece of spyware would utilize resources from a computer. Of course the trucker wouldn't survive, but like most spyware he didn't read the warning. Just clicked OK. Vic dropped all the spells he had up and reached into the trucker's body, metaphysically. As the spider women bared down on him, Vic pulled the parasite from his body and held it up. Every creature in the hive stopped. It writhed in his hand like a decapitated snake. Vic wrapped it around his wand and spoke the words of binding. Best Iola Elijah's. It froze and wrapped around the stick. All the other members of the swarm were just gone. 1 billion down, 2 to go. Chapter 26. The Talent Show. There were no indications of decay, corruption, or dilapidation at James Buchanan Elementary School. The playground showed signs of expected use. The sandboxes were filled with dune sand that spilled over the sides and was not uniform or level. Somehow, there weren't any clumps of sand. The swings were tangled in one another. Mounds and dips beneath the seesaws were pounded into the ground. The sidewalks had fading chalk drawings that shifted into something awful when you looked at them at the top of your vision, where it was the most acute. This curiosity of physiology was one source of the notion of the third eye. You have a higher concentration of rods and cones and can occasionally pick up something mystical with this part of your field of vision. It's just as easily ignored, like you're doing now. Nothing was out of order. Everything was as it should be. In the middle of a town overrun by demons, the school was peaceful. Vic headed for the front door. It was locked. A sign directed him to a visitor's entrance. This one was also sealed at first. As he looked away, Vic heard the turn of a mechanism and nothing else. He tried the door again and it was open. Vic rushed past the foyer and looked for the front office. Immediately connected to the reception area was the hallway that stretched back and branched off into the many classrooms. Only the entrance had any light. The classrooms were dark and it was hard to tell how far back was the darkness. A simple but convincing trick to give the impression that there was no end. Your standard fare was posted on the walls. A number of creepy motivational and instructional posters telling kids about their inside and outside voices, to remember to flush, to not bully. And creepier wall hangings that impressed the need for children to respect authority. To listen to what adults say. To not tattle or else they'd get in trouble. The figures on these posters lived deep in the uncanny valley. In large, blocky letters, "Love thy neighbor" was written beneath a bulbous, porcine, and mustachioed figure who pointed at the children. Another had a Nurse Ratched-looking figure making to stab a child with a syringe. It said, "Always take your medicine." There was a schedule posted. It read, 8:30 to 9 o'clock breakfast, 9 to 9:10 announcements, 9:15 to 11:30 lessons, 11:30 to 12 o'clock mealtime, 12:30 to 1 o'clock recess, unless cancelled, 1:30 to 3 o'clock further lessons, 3:30 to 4 o'clock show and tell, 4 to 5 o'clock physical education, 5 to 7 o'clock homework, 7 to 7:30 story time, 7:30 nighttime, sent to bed without dinner. Every night, Vic thought. The slate had a dusty surface that indicated it had been corrected and adjusted many times before. The writing was legible enough, and yet deliberate. Too perfectly written. As if had been done by fresh hands eager to please that eventually tired. There were scratches on the blackboard's surface. It was surprising that any legible writing could be deciphered from it. A child was at the desk. Very young. Too young to be doing office work, but dutiful. "You have to sign in and I will give you a name tag." "Who are you here for?" she asked. "I need to see the principal," Vic claimed, writing down his name. She filled out a name tag with a barely legible Vic on it. "Lean in," she commanded and slapped it on his chest. "How long you been working here?" Vic asked. "He's going to give a speech for the school assembly." "Maybe you can speak to him afterwards," she answered. The phone rang and she answered it. She didn't say anything and Vic could barely hear what was on the other line. In fact, there was no sound but the expression on her face told him she was paying attention to something. "It's in the cafeteria." Vic looked around to see it, feigning befuddlement. He didn't know where it was, but he didn't want to seem as though he was up to something. It's not too hard to trick children. You can't push them too much, they'll just shut down. If you play to their emotions, they'll get frustrated and mad at you for being stupid and not getting it. It's like trying to teach someone older about how they can fix their computer. They usually just don't want to do it. They want you to do it, so they just act dumb, and eventually you do it without complaining. It's this way, she said and hung up the phone. She emerged from the office and took Vic's hand. She pulled him to the center of 4 hallways. Behind them was the entrance he'd come through, and ahead was the unending dark corridor. To the right was the exit to the gym and playground, and the right was the cafetorium. Where were the children? Over there, she commanded. Don't get lost or you'll get in trouble. Don't go where you're not supposed to or you'll get in trouble. And who you're looking for will get in trouble, she said confidently and went back to the front desk. It was easy enough to stay out of sight as Vic poked through where he wasn't supposed to. When you're a kid, you're always afraid of getting in trouble. With adults, it's called drama and people have a sort of expectation for it. The lockers were empty save for the occasional bit of trash. Post-Columbine and Sandy Hook, kids were little better than prisoners in their schools. School boards might relax when the stifling of their children's freedoms affected their standardized test scores. Just in time for something else to happen, those tragedies were not exculpated by the existence of demons. The usual level of madness and cruelty attracts feeders, but at its core, the evil is entirely human. Things can break in someone's head naturally, or with a casually prescribed bunch of pills. The insidious, quiet nature of the killers means that no one thinks to recommend them for exorcism. Even if it did any good, these kind of tragedies are cases of hindsight being 20/20. Looking for someone to blame after the fact, a demon wouldn't shout for attention before it was able to feed off the terror and fear. Those who acted possessed usually were just crying for help. Of course, with the situation here, things were different. The intel was from a reliable source, at least so far as Vic could trust his own abilities to force reliable information from the fiend. The Baron of Terror here didn't directly cause the fear, but it fed off the emotion enough to grow into a conniving, self-reliant creature. The positive in all this was that the creature, if for a time, might be perfectly content to rule over and feed on the fears of a rapt audience of terrified children. Eventually it would want more flavors. Its abilities were not weakened when turned on other demons or demonic servants either. Every being knows fear of something. Everything was fair game. The demon was a sort of artist and it had made a masterwork here. Not every room had been transformed into some kind of machine to extract the fear from an individual, but many had. Vic gagged and almost threw up. One of the bathrooms reeked. The waste was not being taken away effectively. The floor was wet. Solid and liquid excrement pooled and tracked muck into and out of it. The other one across from it was pristine. Pleasant smelling, even. The sign above the nice one read, "Good boys and girls." Now that he knew where to look, Vic found the other bathroom. The one that said, "Filthy dirty children." Vic looked into the room labeled the teacher's lounge. There was another sign that said, "No students allowed." Blinds obscured one's view into the room, but you could see inside if you squinted between them. Some of the school's teachers, maybe half a dozen, were in there. Not the entire faculty, as each room had to have 1 or 2 people running the show. The bodies sat at the table or the couch, their faces twisted in the rictus that would accompany a heart attack or shock. Cups of coffee still in their laps or on the table in front of them, with bits of floating mold on the liquid surface. The musty and rancid smell indicated that they'd started to decay, but the expected insects had not begun their feast. There were no flies or pests. Where filth wasn't a part of the fun, things were kept pristine. Likely a response to the swarm lord present in the area. A swirl of fly paper hung near the exits and the windows. Dozens of bugs were stuck on it. Vic realized that hidden among the school's decorations were many such traps for the pests. The area was still filthy, but there was less than the expected number of vermin. Vic heard a commotion and so he hid. The bathrooms didn't have any doors, but it was easy enough to take cover. He held his breath and went into the filthy one. No one would get too close if they had a choice. Lights came on in the halls. Most of the tubes had been shattered or needed replacing, so very few of them glowed brightly. Many of the remaining lights flickered. Children, from elementary to junior high, filed out of the classrooms and headed for the cafetorium. They were all dressed in their school uniforms. A navy blue polo shirt and slacks, whether or not it was a boy or a girl. Some of them wore jeans. All of them looked dirty, like the clothes hadn't been washed or replaced in a while. The kids themselves seemed clean enough. They weren't entirely beaten down yet by their situation. No one looked balanced or undisturbed, but they'd fallen into the routine that the Baron had set for them. Kids are resilient. For a demon to get the most out of them, he would have to treat them like a garden. Tend to their needs and not entirely exhaust the soil until mere crop rotation would not persevere in the face of continued exploitation. Vic didn't like kids, but he understood them. Even for a troll like Vic, it was hard to stay focused and detached during this part of the job. It wasn't just the smell that made his eyes watery. Some commotion took place from the teacher's lounge. Animated corpses walked out and went to the classrooms in the least illuminated halls at the back. Most of them looked only slightly less animated than when they were on the job, beaten down by several decades of experience, classroom chaos, disrespect, and bureaucracy. A couple of them were closer to Vic's age than retirement. One of the younger teachers was cute, in a nebbish librarian way. Vic harumphed. They opened the doors and the remainder of the disheveled, beaten, and broken faculty and staff emerged. Some of their expressions of sorrow at the presence of the fresher corpses was apparent. They had been subjected to terrors and traumas for the majority of the occupation. They were for mostly numb. Vic wove another veil spell. He appeared as a janitor who'd been dead for about a week. He ran and caught up with the adults and shambled along into the cafetorium. The children had sat down at the front. Vic could only imagine what had been done to dissuade them from that human tendency to sit towards the back of any assembly. The adults had empty one row between them and the kids. Some of the children peeked back, but when they found who they were looking for among the living, the adults shook their head and bid them look to the front. The shambling corpses didn't get to sit down. Even among demons, servants aren't treated with respect. Most of them had blank faces, unconcerned with the slight. A few of the fresher dead might have wanted to sit down, but not more than they wanted to be alive again. Or finally dead. From stage left, the master of ceremonies appeared. He waved to the audience and the children seemed delighted to see him. The adults tried not to look. It was the school's mascot, an anthropomorphic cow. The costume had many stains and rips at the seams. Its big fake smile showed yellowing on its teeth and eyes. At the corners of its open mouth, bloodstains. There were tears around its horns and the hooves on its feet. Those seemed higher quality than the rest of the costume. No, they were real. The actual parts of the demon poking out. Children, thank you all for coming today. I know you've been practicing really hard for your talent show. But we have a visitor who wasn't invited. So before we get started, he'll have to stop being rude and introduce himself. Mr. Fender. Please. Where are you? He asked and looked around. The cartoony button eyes didn't move, but it was still creepy enough. How do furries put up with this shit? His voice was booming and comical, like a cartoon or a clown's. And like a clown's, it had that ever-present undercurrent of menace that could easily shift to something horrible if it got mad. Or hungry. Or bored. Kids, is it nice to be rude and sneak around like a little rat or thief? He asked. They all yelled, no. The monstrous mascot clasped his hands in delight. Yes, children. What happens when people are rude? He asked again. Misunderstandings. One yelled and was echoed by some others. And when misunderstandings happen, what's next? He asked. People get hurt. They answered, some of them sounding hopeful. Others regretful. A spotlight shined on the cow. He glanced around, trying to find Vic but couldn't. Where are you? He guided the light to move to the dark spots of the cafetorium. Then into the crowd. Why does he want you all to have an accident? That's not a very nice man, the cow said. The room shook and at first bits of dust and drywall fell from the ceiling. Then one of the light fixtures landed close to the children. Then another close to the teachers. He didn't take it as much of a threat, since Vic liked teachers about as much as he liked kids. But he couldn't let this happen. All right, Vic said. The spotlight shined on him and Vic dropped the veil. Nobody is having an accident. I'll play along. I heard some things about you, Mr. Cow. Didn't know what to expect, but now that I see you're on the level, please let me apologize for my rudeness. I'm Mr. Fender. Get him, teachers. Hold him. If he doesn't want to be rude, he won't resist, the cow said. The shamblers held Vic and the little girl at the front office started looking through his pockets. He hadn't kept it in there, but somehow she managed to get Vic's wand. She walked to the cow and gave it to him. So. You dealt with the police station's bug problem. How nice. Isn't that nice, children? Don't we hate bugs? Aren't they scary? He asked, and the chorus of the children agreed and then said all together for about 3 seconds, "Ew, just be careful with that." "You don't want them to come back," Vic said. "Oh, I think I know a thing or two about bugs. And magicians. We were going to have a talent show today, Mr. Fender. Unfortunately, I think you interrupted that. Isn't that terrible, kids?" He asked. "Boo. You're going to have to say you're sorry to everyone, and then you're going to have to show me you can play nice," the cow said. Vic could have resisted the shamblers. They dragged him to the front stage and he had to get close and see what he was dealing with. There were some angry children among the crowd, as well as some hopeful ones. "Look, I'm sure we can come to some kind of deal," Vic said, but the cow cut him off. "No, you aren't going to trick your way out of this, Mr. Fender. We know you've been naughty. We're going to see if you've been too naughty," he said. The kids continued their boos and cheers of disapproval. Something broke through the glass at the left side of the cafeterium. Several men and women dressed in riot gear stormed in. One of them had a grenade launcher that was shooting tear gas into the crowd. Each shot flew out of the weapon with a whoosh and clanked on the ground. Then there was a swish as the gas billowed from the canister. There was immediate crying. Some of the adults ran to the children. Others were knocked down by the remaining shamblers. Most of the animated bodies were crowded around Vic, so he tripped and kicked as best he could. The cow was nowhere to be seen. "You're done playing here, cow. While you were messing with your toys, I grew in strength. Now your followers will join me or perish. And I will eat you." A terrible voice yelled. Not cartoonish and high like the cow's, but low and certain like you'd expect a demon to sound like. Those individuals wearing gas masks pressed forward with an unarmed attack. They rounded up the children, then quickly joined with the teachers and tried to get the kids to safety. A separate group that did have weapons targeted the shamblers and tried to shoot wherever they sensed the cow was. No gas masks this time, no riot gear. Their eyes glowed and at parts of their exposed skin were glowing veins of dark energy. "Well, Mr. Fender, it looks like someone interrupted our party. My brother is right to say that only one of us will get out of here, but he's good at keeping things from being fun. I guess I'll have to owe you one, all that hard work you did for nothing," the cow said. Once again at the stage, Mr. Cow took Vic's wand in both its hands and snapped it in two. Vic would have felt some loss of power, but he severed his connection to the tool when he used it to bind the swarm lord. The cow threw the pieces at opposite sides of the cafeterium and there was a burst of energy. Where the pieces bounced, small fissures shuddered and then glowed. The cracks spread to the size of a couch or love seat and the hive demons emerged. They went after shambler and cop alike. There was collateral damage, but most of the children and free adults were able to escape from the conflict. The cow ran around goring anything in its way. Each servant or insect it took down heightened its frenzy. Vic needed to get his wand back. Then, if he could survive, deal with whoever was left before it consumed the energy of the other baron. The swarm would be beaten back. Its freedom from his domination did not instill a single purpose. The insects were frenzying and easy targets to the coordinated attack of the police. The home field advantage of Mr. Cow meant he could strike from anywhere. His shamblers were little threat to anyone, but he was a spider and this was his web. The bit of energy he gained from one of the insects was quickly expended to terrorize the servants of his sibling rival who had yet to show itself. Vic picked up an assault rifle that was at the feet of a fallen cop and worked his way towards a piece of his wand. He could still feel its presence. When Vic ran out of bullets, the gun made a good enough club to fend off the duck-sized bug demons. Vic got hold of one of the pieces and tried to assert dominance over the swarm. Mostly he kept them out of his way and ordered them continue their pointless assault so that he might get the other piece and remain unmolested. If the stalemate would draw out the other baron, all the better. Vic made his way to where the other piece had landed. He didn't see her at first, just like last time she was too short to be noticed. The little girl secretary was there holding it. She jammed it into her hand and started to transform. It was like a time-lapsed video log of a girl's journey through adolescence, if that girl was one of Satan's daughters. Soon enough her arms were too long and her legs bent the wrong way. The wound dripped a greenish poison mixed with her own blood. She reeled in her heightened power, both from subsuming a considerable part of the swarm lord, and from being emboldened by the chaos that unfolded all around. The other baron was already here. She eyed Vic hungrily. He tossed the other part of his wand to the opposite side. He intended to run, but she continued her approach. Vic's trick didn't stop her. Maniacal laughter did. The cow had caught the discarded stick and stabbed it into one of his cartoon eyes. He roared a bestial sound and his form started to swell. The cow costume ripped apart and he emerged from the metamorphosis a tall, sinewy creature with long claws on its feet and hands, long white horns, and an almost featureless face with long teeth. A sort of ghoulish, wispy creature. Not quite a skeleton, that would be too close to the image of death, but certainly influenced by that image that spread enough terror on its own. They forgot about Vic, at least momentarily. The two leapt into the air and crashed through the ceiling. They couldn't fly, but began their wrestling match on the roof. Vic was caught under some of the rubble and did his best to pull himself out, but some more crashed down on him. No. This isn't how it. And things went black. There were flashing red lights and the smells of raw eggs and burning. Something pulled him from the rubble. It was Montez and some firemen. What happened? Vic asked. Your friend, the guy who stole my truck, found me. Said you were gonna take down the town on your own and suggested that I get some help, she said. He was, Vic said, but stopped himself. What are those, firemen? The thought came to me in my office. The Texas Firemen's Association put out a charity calendar every year, of which I receive thanks to my continued support, she said. Some paramedics were helping others and soon they got to Vic. He dismissed them, but they still insisted he sit down. Get wrapped in a blanket. Have a bottle of water. I didn't know how to help you. But something about what the guy said on the phone, that you were cleaning up the demon-infested town, made me think of water. I bought another calendar for my mom, you see, she continued. A group of priests put one out to protest homophobia amongst the church. The two of them were there on my desk, unopened. And so I put two and two together. Fireman, fire truck. Priest, holy water. No one in the big city would hear me out. But a few towns had lost contact with some of their relatives here and so they were more receptive. These small towns have a greater proportion of believers than your bigger cities. It's the only thing that makes them worthwhile to demons. Something to profane, Vic commented. He tried to summon some energy from within to heal himself, but he felt completely empty. When we arrived we saw people fleeing the school. I told everyone to hide behind the fire hydrant and pray like it was the end of the world. There was chanting and singing and after we turned the hose on those evil things, there wasn't anything left, she said. You certainly earned your cut, Vic said. So is that it then? The town is saved. The demons are gone, she asked, feeling righteous and hopeful. People think they're holy warriors when they kill one pair of feuding demon barons. Those things are gone, yeah. But the big guy is still in his hole. He's weakened now, but it'll just happen all over again if we don't close the case and shut the cage, Vic said. So go cast your spell on the hole and then drinks are on me, she said. We dealt with his lieutenants and that's cut off his access to the power he needs to wake up, as well as near literally dismembering him. But if your company cracks open his prison, nothing's going to keep him from just climbing out of the ground, Vic said. The company is not going to approve an end to drilling. They're already acting like they don't know what I'm talking about when I try to get someone on the phone to give my report, she said. What's going on here is the human brain's capacity for denial and disbelief. That's why we get it in writing, so they pay us even if they don't remember why, Vic said. But that won't happen until we're done with the job. It's not that easy. Between this and Mexico, I don't have the power. I'm burnt out. I don't have time to get enough rest and recovery, Vic said. Even if I was at my peak, I don't know if I could take on the big guy by myself. You haven't lied to me so far, so I won't resist. But please tell me you have something in mind besides screwing off for a few days while you get your magical mojo back, she said. Yeah, I had a backup plan. It's gonna be a few more days. Hopefully I'll get some sleep one of those nights, but we have a unique resource available to us here in Texas. It might be just what we need to put this case to bed and get our paychecks, Vic said. Well, what is it? She asked. Not anything you want to be signing off on. Might not be the most legal preparation. I have to borrow a few things, Vic said. Borrow. She shut up when she figured it out. The less you know, the less you'll be able to rat me out when the authorities come asking. And they're not the kind who would Mirandize you, Vic said. What are you talking about? She asked. I'm gonna have to step on some toes in the wizarding world. If you knew, they could track you down and interrogate you without you even realizing what happened. I'll call you in a couple days if I need anything, or if everything works out, Vic said and headed to his rental car. I'll keep one of the holy fire trucks around. End of part 2. Thank you for listening to my story.